Hi guys. Food and taste in Europe around the year 1300. In the early part of the 14th century, people living across different regions of Europe had certain ideas about what made food enjoyable to eat, and these ideas were shaped by long-standing traditions, religious beliefs, seasonal availability, and the limited means of preserving ingredients for later use. Meals were not designed for entertainment or luxury in most households, and eating was seen more as a necessary activity to maintain strength and health rather than an opportunity for indulgence or celebration on a daily basis. The concept of flavor was tied closely to how familiar a dish felt, how warm it could be served, and whether it provided enough energy to last through hours of physical labor, which was common for the majority of the population at that time. There were no electric stoves or refrigerators, so cooking required gathering wood, lighting fires, and using heavy pots that took a long time to heat up, making the process slow and repetitive throughout the week. Most families lived in small homes with little space for storing food, so they relied on buying or gathering ingredients every few days, depending on where they lived and what kind of work they did during the week. In villages, people often grew their own vegetables in small plots near their houses, while those in towns depended more on markets where vendors sold items like onions, carrots, cabbages, and dried beans that had been stored from earlier harvests. Meat was not eaten every day by most people because animals were expensive to raise and feed, and butchering one meant losing a source of milk, eggs, or wool unless it was absolutely necessary. Instead, meals were built around grains such as barley, rye, and oats, which were turned into thick porridges or coarse bread baked in communal ovens shared by several families in the same area. These grain-based dishes formed the foundation of nearly every meal, and they were often mixed with whatever else was available at the time, including herbs picked from nearby fields or scraps of salted fish brought in from coastal regions. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and saffron existed but were extremely costly and mostly used by wealthy households or in monasteries where monks prepared special meals for visiting dignitaries or religious holidays. For ordinary people, taste came more from the texture of food and the warmth it brought to the body than from complex seasoning or elaborate preparation methods. A piece of dark bread soaked in broth made from boiled bones and leftover vegetables was considered satisfying not because it tasted exciting but because it filled the stomach and helped the person feel less cold during the winter months when temperatures dropped and daylight became shorter. Dairy products such as cheese and sour milk were common in some areas, especially where cows or goats could graze on open land, but they spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so they were consumed soon after being made. Butter was rare and usually reserved for special occasions or medicinal purposes, such as rubbing it on dry skin or mixing it with herbs believed to help with coughs and sore throats. Fruits like apples, pears, and plums grew wild or were cultivated in orchards belonging to nobles or churches, and they were eaten fresh when in season or dried for use during colder times of the year when fresh produce was unavailable. Honey was the main sweetener since sugar was imported from distant lands and too expensive for regular use, and even honey was used sparingly except during festivals or religious celebrations when extra treats were allowed. Water was drunk by many, but it was often unsafe due to contamination, so weak beer or small amounts of wine diluted with water were common beverages even among children, as fermentation killed some harmful organisms and made the liquid safer to consume over time. Cooking techniques remained simple and unchanged for generations, with boiling being the most frequent method because it required only a pot, a fire, and basic tools that almost every household owned. Roasting meat over an open flame happened occasionally, but only when fuel was plentiful and there was enough food to justify the effort of preparing it in that way. Baking in clay ovens or stone hearths occurred mainly in larger homes or institutions like castles and abbeys, where servants worked together to prepare meals for large groups of people who followed strict schedules based on prayer times and daylight hours. Food was rarely eaten alone, and meals were typically shared among family members or co-workers sitting together at wooden tables or benches, passing bowls and cups from one person to another without much concern for individual portions or hygiene standards as understood today. Utensils were minimal, with spoons made of wood or bone being the most common, while forks were almost unknown and knives were carried by individuals for personal use during meals and other daily tasks. Plates did not exist in the modern sense, so food was placed on thick slices of stale bread called trenchers, which absorbed juices and were later given to animals or the poor after the meal ended. Cleaning up after eating involved wiping hands on cloth or grass and sweeping crumbs off surfaces with brooms made of bundled twigs tied to sticks collected from nearby trees. Leftovers were saved whenever possible, added to soups or stews the next day, or fed to pigs and chickens kept outside the home to reduce waste and make use of every bit of edible material. Preservation methods included drying, salting, smoking, and storing in cool cellars or underground pits lined with straw to keep temperature stable, though mold and insects often damaged supplies before they could be fully used. Trade routes brought some exotic items like almonds, figs, raisins, and vinegar to urban centers, but these were still uncommon in rural areas where self-sufficiency was key to survival. Religious rules also influenced what people ate and when they ate it, as fasting periods required avoiding meat, dairy, and eggs for weeks at a time, especially during Lent and other holy seasons observed by the Christian Church. During these times, meals became even simpler, relying heavily on fish, legumes, and vegetables cooked in water or oil pressed from olives if it could be obtained. Fish was eaten more frequently in regions near rivers, lakes, and oceans, where nets and traps were used to catch species like herring, cod, and eel, which were then salted or smoked to extend their shelf life. Some monastic communities maintained fish ponds where they raised carp and other freshwater varieties specifically for consumption on fast days, demonstrating how deeply faith and diet were connected in everyday life. Seasonal changes played a major role in determining what foods were available, with spring and summer offering fresh greens, herbs, and young animals, while autumn brought harvested grains, fruits, and root vegetables stored for winter use. Winter itself was a time of scarcity for many, and people relied on preserved foods, occasional hunting, and charity from wealthier neighbors or church-supported kitchens to survive until the ground thawed and new crops could be planted. Hunger was a constant concern, and entire communities suffered during years of poor harvest caused by bad weather, pests, or war, which disrupted farming and transportation networks essential for food distribution. Despite these challenges, people developed routines around mealtimes that gave structure to their days, rising early to begin work before sunrise and gathering for a main meal in the middle of the day when energy levels needed replenishing. Evening meals were lighter, often consisting of leftovers warmed again or simple snacks like bread with cheese or a boiled egg if one was available. Children learned from an early age how to help prepare food, gather firewood, watch over cooking pots, and avoid burning meals, which would mean going hungry or wasting valuable resources already in short supply. Elders passed down knowledge about which plants were safe to eat, how to tell when meat had gone bad, and which combinations of ingredients might cause stomach discomfort or illness, all based on experience rather than scientific understanding. Superstitions also played a role in food choices, with some believing that certain foods brought good luck, protected against disease, or angered divine forces if consumed at the wrong time. Eating habits varied widely between social classes, with nobles enjoying more variety, better quality ingredients, and access to imported goods, while peasants and laborers focused on filling their stomachs with affordable, durable foods that required little preparation. Still, the idea of taste was not defined by richness or novelty but by consistency, safety, and the ability of a meal to sustain the body through another day of routine existence. Meals were rarely discussed in detail, and there were no cookbooks written for ordinary people, so recipes were shared orally and changed slowly over time as new tools, crops, or influences entered local communities. Travelers sometimes brought stories of foreign dishes, but these were often met with suspicion or indifference unless they aligned with existing customs and ingredient availability. Overall, the experience of eating in Europe around the year 1300 was marked by simplicity, repetition, and practicality, with little emphasis on surprise, excitement, or personal preference in flavor. Food was a necessity first, and any enjoyment derived from it came from its warmth, its familiarity, and its role in bringing people together briefly during otherwise long and tiring days. Grains as the foundation of medieval diets. In the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400, grains played a central role in nearly every meal consumed across all regions regardless of climate, terrain, or local customs, and this reliance on cereal crops was so deeply embedded in everyday existence that it shaped not only what people ate but also how they worked, when they rested, and how entire communities organized their yearly routines around planting, tending, harvesting, drying, storing, grinding, and preparing these essential ingredients that formed the bulk of their caloric intake and provided the primary source of energy needed to endure long days of physical labor in fields, workshops, homes, and marketplaces where little else besides bread, porridge, or gruel could be counted on to appear with any regularity or consistency. The most common grains grown during this period included rye, barley, oats, and wheat, each of which had its own characteristics, growing conditions, and uses depending on the region, soil quality, rainfall patterns, and social status of the people who cultivated or purchased them, and while some areas favored one type over another due to environmental factors such as wetness, cold, or poor drainage, most households used whatever grain was available locally because transportation was slow. Roads were often impassable, and buying food from distant places was expensive and unreliable except for those who lived near rivers, trade routes, or larger towns where merchants occasionally brought sacks of imported flour or unmilled kernels from neighboring territories. Rye was especially widespread in northern and eastern Europe, where the cooler temperatures and heavier soils made it easier to grow than wheat, and although rye produced a dense, dark loaf with a slightly sour taste and coarse texture, it was valued for its ability to survive harsh winters and yield a harvest even when other crops failed, making it a dependable staple for peasants, servants, and laborers who could not afford to take risks with less resilient plants that required richer soil. Careful tending, and protection from pests, frost, or flooding that frequently damaged fields and left families without enough food to last through the winter months when fresh supplies were unavailable and stored provisions began to run low. Barley was another widely used grain, often boiled into thick porridges or mixed with vegetables, scraps of meat, or fish to create filling stews that could be stretched to feed many mouths with minimal ingredients. And since barley matured quickly and grew well in poor quality soil, it was commonly planted in areas where nothing else would thrive, though it was generally considered less desirable than wheat or rye for baking bread because it did not rise well, stuck to cooking pots, and produced a gummy consistency that many found unpleasant unless combined with other flours or thoroughly strained after boiling. Oats were primarily grown in wetter climates such as parts of Britain, Ireland, and northern France, where frequent rain made wheat cultivation difficult, and they were usually eaten as porridge, cooked slowly over a fire until soft and creamy, or dried and stored for later use during seasons when fresh milk or butter might be added if any could be spared, though more often they were prepared plain with water and a pinch of salt if any could be spared, and despite their nutritional value, oats were sometimes seen as animal feed rather than human food in certain regions, especially among wealthier classes who associated them with poverty, rural backwardness, or the diets of soldiers and travelers who carried them on long journeys because they were lightweight, non-perishable, and easy to prepare with minimal equipment. Wheat, when it could be grown successfully, was regarded as the most desirable grain because it produced lighter, softer bread with a finer crumb and a milder flavor compared to the heavier loaves made from rye or barley, and white wheat bread was particularly prized by nobles, clergy, and wealthy town dwellers who could afford both the high cost of finely sifted flour and the fuel required to bake it properly in ovens that maintained consistent heat over several hours. But for most ordinary people, access to pure wheat was limited, and even when it was available, it was often mixed with cheaper grains to stretch the supply and reduce expenses, resulting in hybrid loaves known as maslin bread, which combined wheat and rye in varying proportions depending on availability, harvest success, and economic conditions that fluctuated from year to year based on weather, war, disease, or changes in taxation imposed by local rulers or feudal overlords who claimed a portion of each harvest as rent or tribute for the right to farm the land. Harvesting grain was a labor-intensive process that involved cutting stalks by hand using sickles or scythes, gathering them into sheaves, transporting them to threshing floors where animals trampled over them to separate the edible kernels from the chaff, winnowing the mixture by tossing it into the air so that the wind would blow away the lighter husks while the heavier grains fell back down onto cloths or wooden surfaces, and then bagging or boxing the clean grain for storage in barns, cellars, or communal granaries that were vulnerable to dampness, mold, rodents, and theft if not carefully guarded and regularly inspected throughout the year. Once harvested and stored, grain had to be ground into flour before it could be used for cooking, and this task was typically done at home using hand-operated corn stones made of two circular rocks stacked together, the top one rotated manually to crush the kernels beneath it, producing a coarse powder that retained much of the bran and germ and gave bread a gritty texture and darker color than modern refined flours, though some villages had access to water-powered or wind-powered mills, operated by millers who charged a fee for their services, usually taking a small percentage of the grain as payment for grinding it into a slightly finer product that still contained impurities such as bits of stone, dust, or insect fragments that could not be fully removed without advanced sifting techniques that did not exist at the time. Baking bread was one of the most important household activities, and in many places, families did not have private ovens but instead relied on shared communal ovens located in central areas of villages or within monastery grounds, where residents brought their dough on designated days and waited their turn to place it inside the heated chamber after the previous batch had finished baking and the temperature had been adjusted by experienced bakers who judged readiness by touch, smell, and experience rather than precise measurements or timers, and since maintaining an even heat was difficult, especially in ovens built from clay or stone that absorbed and released warmth unevenly, loaves often emerged partially burned on the outside and undercooked within, requiring further toasting over open flames or slicing and drying to prevent spoilage. Bread itself came in many forms depending on region, class, and occasion, ranging from large round loaves baked once a week and sliced as needed to small flatbreads cooked quickly on hot stones near fires, and while rich households might enjoy softer, wider bread served on clean cloths with knives and spoons, poorer families ate dense, heavy loaves that lasted longer but were hard to chew, sometimes needing to be soaked in broth, milk, or ale to soften them enough for consumption, especially by children, the elderly, or those suffering from dental problems caused by poor hygiene, worn teeth, or chronic illness. Porridge was another common way of preparing grain, particularly for breakfast or evening meals, and it was made by slowly stirring crushed or coarsely ground kernels into boiling water or milk until they thickened into a mushy consistency that could be flavored with salt, honey, dried fruit, or leftover fat if any was available, though most versions were plain and monotonous, eaten out of wooden bowls with spoons carved from scrap wood or animal bone, and often reheated multiple times over several days until the original texture broke down completely and the dish became more like a sticky paste than a proper meal. Storage of grain was a constant concern, as damp conditions encouraged mold growth, insects infested stored sacks, and mice or rats could consume significant portions of a family's supply overnight if containers were not sealed properly in chests made of wood, pottery jars coated with resin, or pits dug into dry ground and lined with straw to absorb moisture and keep temperatures stable, and even with precautions, losses were common, forcing households to ration their flour during lean periods and rely on alternative foods such as roots, greens, or legumes until the next harvest brought fresh supplies. Because grain was so vital to survival, its production and distribution were closely tied to social structure, land ownership, and religious observance, with feudal lords controlling large estates where peasants worked the fields in exchange for permission to keep a portion of the crop for themselves, while churches collected tithes in the form of grain that supported priests, monks, and charitable kitchens that fed the poor, sick, or homeless during times of famine or crisis, reinforcing the idea that food was not merely sustenance but also a symbol of duty, obedience, and divine order in a world where stability depended on everyone fulfilling their assigned role without question or complaint. Meals centered around grain were rarely varied, and people accepted that they would eat similar dishes day after day with only slight differences based on season, location, or special events such as weddings, funerals, or religious festivals when extra effort might be made to produce a better loaf, add a bit of honey, or serve warm porridge with melted butter, though even these occasions did not dramatically alter the overall pattern of eating, which remained rooted in repetition, necessity, and quiet endurance rather than pleasure, novelty, or personal choice. The act of preparing grain-based food was repetitive and time-consuming, involving hours of kneading dough, watching pots, cleaning tools, and managing fires, and women and children bore most of this responsibility, passing down knowledge about consistency, rising times, oven heat, and storage methods through observation and practice rather than written instruction, since literacy was rare and cookbooks did not exist for common households. Over time, small changes occurred in how grain was processed and used, such as the gradual improvement of mill technology, the introduction of new strains of wheat through trade or marriage alliances between noble families, or the adoption of slightly different recipes influenced by contact with travelers, pilgrims, or returning soldiers. But these shifts happened so slowly that individuals might live their entire lives without noticing any meaningful difference in the taste, texture, or appearance of the bread or porridge they consumed every day. For most people, the concept of flavor in grain-based dishes was not linked to richness, sweetness, or complexity but to familiarity, warmth, and fullness, and a piece of slightly stale bread dipped in thin soup was considered satisfying not because it tasted good in any exciting way but because it filled the stomach, required no chewing effort if softened first, and reminded the eater of countless other meals just like it that had sustained them through childhood, adulthood, and old age in a cycle of quiet repetition that defined the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. There was little discussion about improving taste, inventing new recipes, or experimenting with ingredients, because the purpose of food was not to entertain or inspire but to preserve life, maintain strength, and allow people to continue working, praying, sleeping, and eventually dying in the same unremarkable way that generations before them had done, leaving behind few records, fewer memories, and almost no trace of what exactly they thought about the bread they ate each morning or the porridge they stirred each evening as the fire dimmed and the room grew cold. Vegetables, herbs, and wild plants in daily meals in the households of people living across Europe during the 14th century. Vegetables played a supporting role in most meals, rarely taking center stage but instead serving as additions to grain-based dishes that relied on bread, porridge, or boiled grains as the primary source of sustenance, and although vegetables were consumed regularly by both rural and urban populations, they were not considered essential in the same way that grains or preserved foods were, and their presence on the table depended heavily on the time of year, local growing conditions, access to garden space, and the overall economic situation of the family preparing the meal, which meant that availability could vary greatly from one region to another and even from one week to the next depending on weather patterns, soil quality, or disruptions caused by war, disease, or migration that affected planting schedules and harvest yields in unpredictable ways. Commonly grown vegetables included cabbage, onions, leeks, garlic, carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beans, all of which were hardy enough to survive in temperate climates and could be stored for limited periods without spoiling if kept in cool, dry places such as cellars, root pits, or underground storage chambers dug beneath homes or barns where temperatures remained relatively stable throughout the winter months when fresh produce was no longer available from fields or gardens. Cabbage was one of the most widely used vegetables because it grew well in many types of soil, required little maintenance once planted, and could be harvested late into the fall or even early winter before freezing temperatures made it inedible, and it was often chopped finely and added to soups, stews, or pottages, thick mixtures of grain, water, fat, and whatever else was on hand, that simmered for hours over low fires in heavy iron or clay pots suspended above open flames or placed directly on hot stones near hearths where heat radiated unevenly and required constant attention to prevent burning or sticking. Onions and garlic were valued not only for their ability to add mild flavor to otherwise bland dishes but also for their long shelf life and resistance to rot, and they were frequently dried after harvest and hung in bundles from rafters or beams inside homes where air circulated freely and moisture levels were lower, allowing them to remain usable for several months, though they often became shriveled, soft, or moldy over time and had to be inspected carefully before being cut and added to cooking pots where even small amounts could subtly alter the taste of a dish without drawing attention to themselves or overwhelming other ingredients. Carrots at this time were not the bright orange variety familiar today but rather purple, yellow, or white roots that were smaller, tougher, and more fibrous, and they were usually boiled until soft or grated into mixtures that included other vegetables, grains, or scraps of meat to stretch the volume of food served to larger groups of people sharing a single pot. Beans and peas, whether fresh in season or dried for later use, were important sources of protein for those who could not afford meat on a regular basis, and they were typically soaked in water overnight to rehydrate them before being boiled slowly into mushy textures that blended easily with fats, herbs, or leftover broth, forming the base of many humble meals eaten in silence or with minimal conversation during brief pauses in daily labor. Turnips and parsnips were often grown together in kitchen gardens or cultivated plots near homes, and they provided a starchy, slightly sweet component to meals that helped balance the acidity of fermented foods or the saltiness of preserved fish and meats, and since they could be left in the ground for weeks after maturity without spoiling, they were sometimes dug up gradually as needed, though this practice carried risks if the soil froze too deeply or if animals disturbed the beds during cold nights when hunger drove them closer to human settlements in search of food. In addition to cultivated crops, many families relied on wild plants gathered from forests, meadows, riverbanks, and uncultivated fields, where knowledgeable individuals, often older women or children taught by elders, collected edible greens such as nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, chickweed, and wild mustard, all of which could be boiled and eaten like spinach or mixed into grain dishes to increase bulk and provide trace nutrients that might otherwise be missing from diets dominated by starch and fat. Nettles, despite their painful sting when touched raw, were particularly common in springtime meals, when stored supplies ran low and fresh growth emerged early in the season, and they were carefully picked using gloves made of cloth or leather, then washed and cooked thoroughly to neutralize their irritants before being stirred into porridges or combined with onions and fat to create simple side dishes that required no seasoning beyond salt if it was available. Herbs such as parsley, sage, thyme, mint, and fennel were grown in small clusters near doorways or along fences where they were easy to reach, and while some were used sparingly to add subtle notes to food, most were not employed for flavoring in the modern sense but rather for perceived health benefits, as many people believed certain plants could aid digestion, cleanse the blood, or protect against illness when consumed regularly. even if their actual effect was minimal or entirely symbolic. Parsley, for example, was thought to help with stomach discomfort and bad breath, so it was often chewed after meals or added to dishes near the end of cooking, while sage was associated with longevity and mental clarity, leading some to include it in teas or broths intended for the elderly or sick. Mint was appreciated for its cooling sensation and pleasant smell, especially during warmer months when food spoiled quickly and strong odors filled homes, and it was sometimes placed in storage areas to repel insects or laid between layers of cloth to keep clothing smelling fresh, though it was also used in cooking when nothing else was available. The preparation of vegetables was generally simple and repetitive, involving peeling when possible, chopping with dull knives on wooden boards stained with years of use, and boiling in large quantities of water until soft enough to eat. And since fuel was expensive and firewood had to be collected by hand, multiple ingredients were often cooked together in the same pot to save time, effort, and resources, resulting in meals where flavors blended together indistinctly and individual components lost their original characteristics through prolonged exposure to heat and liquid. Frying was rare because oil and animal fat were precious commodities reserved for special occasions or medicinal uses, and roasting vegetables separately from other foods was almost unheard of due to the inefficiency of using fire for anything other than essential tasks like baking bread or heating water for washing. Most vegetable dishes were served lukewarm or at room temperature, having cooled during the long gap between cooking and eating, and they were eaten from shared bowls using spoons made of wood, horn, or bone, with fingers occasionally used to pick out larger pieces or adjust portions when necessary. Preservation methods for vegetables were limited and largely ineffective by modern standards, with drying being the most common technique for items like beans, peas, and certain herbs, while root vegetables were stored in sand, straw, or sawdust to slow decay and maintain moisture, though mold, sprouting, and insect damage were frequent problems that reduced usable quantities over time. Pickling existed but was uncommon among ordinary households due to the cost of vinegar, which had to be imported or produced locally in small batches from wine or apple scraps, and brining required large amounts of salt, which was also expensive and closely regulated in many regions, making these methods accessible mainly to wealthier families or institutions such as monasteries and castles where supplies were more secure and waste could be better managed. As a result, most vegetables were consumed fresh during their growing season, and people accepted that their diet would become increasingly monotonous during winter and early spring when only dried legumes, stored roots, and occasional imports provided any variation from the usual bread and broth routine. There was little emphasis placed on presentation, variety, or culinary creativity when it came to vegetables, and meals were not judged by how appetizing they looked or tasted but by how effectively they filled the stomach and sustained energy levels through another day of physical work, prayer, or household duties that followed predictable patterns with few surprises or deviations. Children learned from an early age to eat whatever was given to them without complaint, and parents discouraged pickiness by reminding them of times when food was scarce and even spoiled vegetables or bitter greens had to be eaten to avoid starvation, reinforcing the idea that gratitude and endurance were more important than personal preference or enjoyment. Religious beliefs also influenced attitudes toward plant-based foods, as fasting periods required abstaining from meat, dairy, and eggs, making vegetables, legumes, and grains the sole components of meals for extended stretches of time, particularly during Lent and other holy observances when entire communities adhered to strict dietary rules that emphasized simplicity, humility, and self-denial as spiritual practices meant to purify the body and strengthen faith. During these times, vegetable dishes were prepared in much the same way as usual, with no attempt to mimic the texture or flavor of meat or to make the food more appealing, and people accepted the repetition and blandness as part of their religious duty, rarely expressing dissatisfaction or longing for richer fare. Markets in towns and cities sometimes offered a slightly wider selection of vegetables brought in from surrounding villages or transported along rivers by boat, but these items were often wilted, damaged, or overpriced, limiting access for poorer residents who relied on homegrown produce or charity distributions organized by churches and charitable organizations that provided basic rations during times of hardship. Cooking knowledge was passed down orally from generation to generation, with young girls learning how to identify edible plants, prepare them safely, and combine them with other ingredients under the supervision of mothers or grandmothers who had spent decades mastering the same routines without ever writing anything down or consulting outside sources. Since literacy was rare and printed materials did not exist for domestic topics like food preparation. Over time, small changes occurred in gardening practices and ingredient combinations due to contact with travelers, returning crusaders, or merchants who introduced new ideas about cultivation or usage, but these influences spread slowly and were often adapted to fit existing customs rather than replacing them outright, so the overall pattern of vegetable consumption remained remarkably consistent throughout the century. For most people, the experience of eating vegetables was unremarkable and forgettable, blending into the background of daily life like breathing or walking, and no one remembered exactly what they had eaten yesterday or expected anything different tomorrow, because the rhythm of meals was governed by necessity, tradition, and the slow turning of the seasons rather than choice, desire, or innovation, and this quiet continuity provided a sense of stability in a world where change was often dangerous, unwelcome, and best avoided whenever possible. In the everyday lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400, meat was not a regular part of most diets and was instead regarded as a rare addition to meals that occurred only on special occasions, during certain seasons, or among those who had enough wealth, land, or social status to afford it on a somewhat predictable basis, while for the majority of the population, especially peasants, laborers, and urban workers, eating meat was an infrequent event that might happen once every few weeks or even less often depending on location, economic conditions, religious restrictions, and access to animals that could be slaughtered without causing long-term hardship to the household relying on them for milk, eggs, wool, or plowing fields. The types of animals consumed varied by region and availability, with pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, chickens, geese, and ducks being the most common sources of meat, and each had its own role in the agricultural economy that extended far beyond food, meaning that killing an animal was never done lightly and usually required careful planning, permission from landowners in some cases, and consideration of how the loss would affect future productivity, especially if the animal was young, healthy, or still capable of producing offspring or labor for several more years. Pigs were among the most frequently eaten animals because they grew quickly, required relatively little care compared to other livestock, could be fed on scraps, acorns gathered from forests, and waste products from grain processing, and produced large amounts of fat and meat when slaughtered, making them ideal for preservation through salting, smoking, or drying, which allowed families to store portions for use during winter months when fresh food was scarce and hunting was difficult due to snow, ice, and short daylight hours. Sheep and goats provided wool, milk, and cheese in addition to meat, so they were usually kept alive as long as possible unless they became too old to produce or injured in ways that made recovery unlikely, and when they were finally butchered, nearly every part of the animal was used, including organs, blood, bones, and skin, with nothing discarded unless it showed clear signs of disease or decay that made it unsafe to consume. Cattle were valuable for their strength in plowing fields and transporting goods, so they were rarely killed for meat except in cases of extreme need, old age, or injury, and when one was slaughtered, it was often a community event where neighbors gathered to help with the work, share in the distribution of cuts, and participate in rituals or traditions meant to express gratitude for the animal's life and ensure that no part went to waste, reinforcing the idea that meat was not simply food but also a resource tied to survival, cooperation, and respect for natural cycles. Chickens and other poultry were kept in small numbers by many households, primarily for their eggs, but they were also eaten when they stopped laying, became sick, or reached an age where continued care was no longer practical, and while individual birds did not provide much meat, they could be added to soups, stews, or grain mixtures to enhance flavor and nutrition without requiring significant preparation or fuel. Hunting was another source of meat, though it was largely restricted to nobles and landowners who held exclusive rights to hunt on certain lands, and common people who hunted without permission risked severe punishment, including fines, imprisonment, or physical harm, so most rural residents relied on trapping small game such as rabbits, hares, birds, or squirrels using snares, nets, or simple tools made from wood and rope, and these animals, though small in size, contributed important protein to diets that otherwise depended heavily on grains, legumes, and preserved foods. Wild boar, deer, and other large animals were occasionally caught in forests or open fields, but they were typically claimed by local lords or shared among high-ranking officials, leaving little for ordinary families unless they received portions as gifts, rewards, or charity during festivals or religious celebrations when surplus meat might be distributed to gain favor or demonstrate generosity. Butchering an animal was a labor-intensive process that required skill, sharp tools, strong hands, and knowledge of anatomy to ensure that the meat was removed cleanly, organs were set aside for immediate use, and blood was collected for making sausages or puddings that could be cooked later, and since refrigeration did not exist, the entire process had to take place quickly and efficiently, usually in cold weather when lower temperatures slowed spoilage and allowed meat to remain safe for several days before being preserved. Preservation methods included salting, drying, smoking, and packing in fat, all of which helped extend shelf life but altered the taste, texture, and appearance of the meat significantly, often making it tough, salty, or dry by the time it was finally cooked and eaten, sometimes weeks or even months after slaughter. Salted pork, known as bacon or gammon, was one of the most common preserved meats and could be stored for long periods in wooden barrels or hung from rafters in cool rooms where air circulated freely, and it was usually soaked in water for hours or days before cooking to reduce salt content and rehydrate the fibers, then boiled slowly with vegetables, grains, or herbs to make stews that softened the meat and blended flavors into a uniform mixture where individual ingredients lost their distinctiveness over time. Fresh meat, when available, was typically boiled rather than roasted because boiling required less fuel, allowed multiple items to be cooked together, and made tough cuts more tender through prolonged exposure to liquid and heat, while roasting was reserved for wealthier households that could afford both the firewood and the space needed for open flame cooking, often done in large halls with high ceilings to manage smoke and accommodate big joints of meat turned on spits by servants working for hours to keep them rotating evenly. Meat dishes were rarely seasoned with anything beyond onions, garlic, or basic herbs like parsley or sage, and spices such as pepper, cinnamon, or saffron were almost never used by ordinary people due to their extreme cost and limited availability, so flavor came more from fat, bone broth, and the slow blending of ingredients than from deliberate attempts to create complex tastes or aromatic combinations. Meals containing meat were usually shared among family members or neighbors, with portions distributed according to age, status, and contribution to household labor, and children often received smaller pieces or were given soup made from boiled bones while adults ate the solid parts, reflecting social hierarchies that govern not only food distribution but also daily interactions within homes and communities. For many, the experience of eating meat was not associated with pleasure or excitement but with relief, fullness, and temporary satisfaction after periods of scarcity or physical strain, and there was little discussion about taste, preparation, or preference because expectations were low and alternatives were limited, so even tough, greasy, or overly salty meat was accepted without complaint as a sign of good fortune or divine blessing. Religious rules also played a major role in determining when meat could be eaten, as the Christian Church imposed numerous fasting days throughout the year when believers were required to abstain from all animal products, including meat, dairy, and eggs, especially during Lent, Advent, and certain weekdays like Fridays and Wednesdays, and these restrictions applied to everyone regardless of class, meaning that even wealthy individuals had to adjust their diets seasonally and rely on fish, legumes, and vegetables during extended periods when meat was forbidden, reinforcing the idea that dietary choices were not personal but moral, spiritual, and deeply embedded in communal rhythms of worship, penance, and self-denial. As a result, meat consumption followed a cyclical pattern tied to the liturgical calendar, with spikes in activity around major holidays like Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days when feasting was permitted and encouraged as a way of celebrating faith and abundance, though even these events rarely involved extravagant displays for most people, who continued to eat modestly and pragmatically even on festive occasions. Cooking meat required constant attention to avoid burning, undercooking, or wasting precious fuel, and pots were often left simmering for hours or even days, with additional water or broth added as needed to prevent drying out, and since kitchen tools were basic and cleaning was infrequent, residue built up over time on pots, spoons, and cutting surfaces, contributing to a persistent smell of grease and old food that lingered in homes regardless of ventilation or efforts to remove it. Leftovers were reused whenever possible, added to new batches of stew, mixed into porridge, or served cold the next day, and bones were saved to make broth for future meals, ensuring that nothing was wasted and every bit of edible material was extracted through repeated heating and straining. There was little variation in how meat was prepared across regions, and recipes were passed down orally rather than written, so changes occurred very slowly over generations, with new techniques, tools, or ingredient combinations taking decades to become common practice, if they were adopted at all. Over time, some influence came from trade, travel, and contact with other cultures, especially in port cities or areas near monasteries where monks experimented with different methods of preservation or preparation, but these innovations rarely reached rural populations, who continued to follow traditional routines without questioning or seeking improvement. For most people, meat remained a background element of diet rather than a central focus, appearing irregularly and consumed quietly, without celebration or commentary, and no one remembered exactly when they last ate it or expected it to return soon, because the rhythm of life was shaped by necessity, routine, and acceptance of limitation rather than desire, novelty, or indulgence, and this quiet endurance defined the way food was experienced in medieval Europe, where satisfaction came not from richness or variety but from continuity, predictability, and the simple act of surviving another day without hunger. Fish, fasting, and religious influence on diet in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400, fish played a significant role in diets, especially in regions near rivers, lakes, or coastal areas where access to fresh or preserved seafood was more consistent than in inland or mountainous regions, and while fish was not as commonly consumed as grains, vegetables, or meat in most households, it was an essential component of meals for many, particularly during periods of religious fasting when the Christian Church prohibited the consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs, and required believers to eat only plant-based foods or fish as alternatives that were considered less luxurious and therefore more appropriate for spiritual reflection, penance, and humility. The most commonly eaten fish included herring, cod, mackerel, eel, and salmon, all of which were available in different seasons depending on migration patterns, water temperatures, and local fishing practices, and they were often caught using simple methods such as nets, traps, spears, or lines made from animal sinew or woven grass, with larger catches sometimes stored in barrels filled with salt, vinegar, or brine to preserve them for longer periods and allow for distribution to communities that had no direct access to fresh water sources or reliable fishing grounds. Salted and dried fish were particularly valuable because they could be kept for months without spoiling, and they were used to supplement diets during times of scarcity, especially in winter when other food sources became limited due to cold weather, snow-covered fields, and reduced availability of fresh produce. And even though these preserved fish were often tough, dry, and heavily seasoned, they provided a necessary source of protein and nutrients that helped sustain people through long periods of hardship and uncertainty. In coastal towns and villages, fishing was a primary occupation for many families, and small boats were used to catch fish in open waters, while in inland areas, rivers and streams were the main sources of supply, with some communities maintaining fish ponds or reservoirs where carp, pike, or other freshwater species were raised specifically for consumption during fasting days or special occasions, and these ponds were carefully managed by monks, landowners, or local authorities who understood the importance of maintaining a steady supply of food for both religious and practical purposes. The preparation of fish varied depending on location, season, and available resources, but boiling, stewing, and drying were the most common methods used, with fish often cooked in large pots alongside vegetables, grains, or legumes to create hearty stews that could feed multiple people at once. And since firewood was expensive and cooking required constant attention, many families reused the same pot for several meals, adding new ingredients and reusing old broth until the mixture became thick, murky, and difficult to distinguish from previous batches, creating a uniform texture and flavor that did not change much over time. Smoked fish was another popular option, especially in colder climates where the air remained cool enough to prevent spoilage, and it was often hung in open spaces or placed in wooden racks near fires to dry slowly, producing a firm, chewy consistency that could be eaten directly or softened by soaking in water before being added to soups or porridges, though this process sometimes took hours or even days, and the final result was rarely as appetizing as fresh fish, which was usually reserved for wealthier households or special occasions where preservation was not necessary. For those who lived far from water sources or could not afford to buy fish regularly, the idea of eating it was often associated with religious observance rather than personal preference, and many believed that consuming fish during fasting periods was a way to show devotion, discipline, and obedience to the Church's teachings, reinforcing the notion that food was not simply about taste or comfort but also about spiritual duty, self-control, and the rejection of worldly pleasures in favor of moral purity and divine favor. During these times, meals became simpler and more structured, with fish replacing meat in most dishes, and there was little variation in how it was prepared or served, as the focus remained on following religious rules rather than experimenting with flavors or textures, and even when fish was available, it was often boiled in plain water or combined with minimal seasoning, making it one of the least flavorful components of the diet, though it was still considered a necessary part of life that helped maintain strength and energy during long periods of abstinence from other foods. Religious festivals and holy days also influenced the types of fish that were consumed, with certain species becoming associated with specific events or traditions, and some communities developed rituals around the preparation and sharing of fish meals, such as distributing portions to the poor, offering gifts to priests, or holding communal feasts in honor of saints or martyrs who were believed to have died for their faith. And although these events were not always extravagant, they reinforced the idea that food was a shared experience, a symbol of community, and a means of expressing gratitude, piety, or hope for the future. In monastic communities, where strict dietary rules were enforced by religious orders, fish was often the main source of animal protein, and monks maintained large fish ponds or rented space on nearby rivers to ensure a steady supply, and while they avoided indulgence in rich or spicy dishes, they did take care to prepare fish in ways that were both practical and respectful, sometimes using herbs, salt, or simple broths to enhance its natural flavor, though these additions were never excessive or seen as luxuries, and the overall approach to eating remained humble, disciplined, and focused on necessity rather than enjoyment. Even among the wealthy, who had access to a wider variety of foods, fish was not always considered a delicacy, and its use was often limited to specific times of the year or special occasions, with richer meats, cheeses, and wines being preferred for celebrations, banquets, and formal gatherings, and this distinction reflected broader societal values that associated meat with status, power, and abundance, while fish was seen as a more modest, accessible, and spiritually acceptable choice for those who wished to live humbly or follow religious guidelines. Despite these differences, the presence of fish in daily meals was a common thread across all levels of society, and it played a crucial role in maintaining the balance between sustenance, tradition, and religious practice, ensuring that even in times of scarcity or restriction, people could find nourishment in the simplest forms of food that required no elaborate preparation, no excess, and no waste, and that aligned with the values of endurance, simplicity, and quiet acceptance that defined the way people lived and ate in medieval Europe. Dairy products and their limited role in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400, dairy products such as cheese, milk, and butter played a role in diets, though they were not as consistently available or widely consumed as grains, vegetables, or fish, and their presence on the table depended largely on the type of community, the season of the year, and the availability of livestock that could be used for milking, grazing, or other agricultural purposes. And while some households had access to fresh milk or small quantities of cheese, others relied on stored or dried forms of dairy that could be preserved for longer periods, making them more practical in times of scarcity or when transporting goods was difficult due to poor roads, harsh weather, or limited resources. Cheese was one of the most common dairy products, and it was produced from the milk of cows, goats, or sheep, which were often kept in small numbers by families who needed their milk for drinking, cooking, or making soft cheeses that could be eaten soon after production, while harder varieties were aged for weeks or months using salt, brine, or simple drying methods that helped prevent spoilage and allowed for storage in cool, dry places such as cellars, under floorboards, or inside wooden chests lined with cloth or straw, though even these methods were not always effective, and many cheeses became moldy, rancid, or infested with insects if not carefully monitored and rotated regularly. Milk itself was less commonly consumed by adults than by children, especially in rural areas where cows or goats were raised for both milk and meat, and while some families drank fresh milk directly from the animal, it was usually boiled before being used in recipes or given to young children who could not yet tolerate raw liquid without risk of illness, and because milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, it was often used to make simple foods like soups, porridges, or thin breads that could be eaten immediately or stored for short periods, though these preparations were rarely elaborate or varied, and they tended to be bland, watery, or unappetizing unless combined with other ingredients such as herbs, grains, or scraps of fat to add texture and flavor. Butter was even rarer than cheese or milk, and it was typically reserved for special occasions, medicinal uses, or the households of wealthier individuals who had access to large quantities of cream from well-fed cows. And while some villages or monasteries may have produced small amounts of butter for local consumption, it was generally considered a luxury item that required careful handling and storage in cool, dark places to prevent melting or rancidity, and even then, it was often used sparingly, either spread thinly on bread, mixed into porridge, or added to stews in small amounts to enhance richness and moisture, though the overall effect was minimal compared to the heavy use of fats like lard or tallow, which were more readily available and easier to produce in large quantities. The production of dairy products was labor-intensive and time-consuming, requiring constant care of animals, regular milking, and careful preparation of tools and containers to avoid contamination, and since there were no modern pasteurization techniques or sterilization methods, milk and cheese were often associated with health risks, leading many people to avoid consuming them unless absolutely necessary, especially during times of illness, poor weather, or high humidity that increased the likelihood of spoilage and bacterial growth, and in some cases, people believed that certain types of dairy could cause digestive discomfort, fever, or imbalance in the body's humors, reinforcing the idea that food should be chosen carefully and consumed in moderation rather than indulged in for pleasure or variety. In addition to the challenges of preserving dairy, there were also social and economic factors that influenced its availability, with wealthier households having greater access to fresh milk, cheese, and butter due to their ability to maintain larger herds, invest in better storage facilities, and hire additional help for daily tasks like feeding, cleaning, and milking, while poorer families often had to rely on what little they could gather from nearby farms, trade with neighbors, or receive as part of religious or communal distributions, and even then, the quantities were limited and subject to seasonal changes that made it difficult to plan meals around dairy-based dishes. Religious beliefs also played a role in how dairy was consumed, as the Christian Church sometimes restricted the use of milk and cheese during fasting periods, especially in the same way that meat and eggs were banned, and while this rule was not always strictly enforced, it reinforced the idea that dairy was a secondary food source that should be used sparingly and only when necessary, rather than as a regular part of the diet, and this attitude extended to monastic communities, where strict dietary regulations governed what could be eaten and when, and even monks who lived in isolated abbeys often avoided excessive consumption of dairy to maintain discipline, humility, and a focus on spiritual rather than physical nourishment. Despite these limitations, dairy products were still valued for their ability to provide essential nutrients, especially for children, the elderly, and those recovering from illness, and they were often used in combination with other foods to create simple, nourishing meals that could sustain people through long days of work, prayer, or rest. And although the taste and texture of dairy-based dishes were not always appealing, they were accepted as part of the natural order of life, where every meal served a purpose, and every ingredient contributed to the survival of the household in a world where abundance was rare and waste was discouraged at all costs. Over time, small variations in dairy consumption emerged based on region, climate, and cultural practices, with some areas favoring certain types of cheese, milk, or butter over others depending on local traditions, available resources, or historical influences. But these differences were subtle and did not significantly alter the overall pattern of eating, which remained focused on simplicity, repetition, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort or satisfaction, and this quiet endurance defined the way people experienced food in medieval Europe, where the value of a meal was measured not by its taste or complexity, but by its ability to keep the body strong, the mind clear, and the soul in balance with the rhythms of nature, faith, and duty. Drinks people consumed with their meals in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400. Drinking was a necessary part of eating, and water, beer, ale, wine, and occasionally other beverages were consumed regularly as companions to meals, though the types and quantities of drinks varied depending on location, season, social status, and availability. And while some people drank only water or diluted wine, others had access to stronger or more frequent sources of liquid that could be used for hydration, warmth, or even medicinal purposes, and despite the lack of modern sanitation or filtration methods, most people relied on what was available at the time, believing that drinking from rivers, wells, or communal vessels was a natural and safe practice, even if it sometimes led to illness or discomfort due to contamination. Water was the most common drink, especially in rural areas where wells, streams, and rainwater collection systems provided a steady supply, and it was often used to cook food, wash dishes, or dilute stronger liquids like beer or wine, but it was also consumed directly when needed, especially during hot weather or after long hours of physical labor. And although many believed that water should be boiled or filtered to avoid sickness, this practice was not always possible, and people often drank from the same source used by animals, which increased the risk of disease and made clean water a rare and valuable commodity in some regions. Beer and ale were among the most widely consumed drinks, especially in towns and villages where brewing was a common household or small-scale industry, and they were made from barley, wheat, or rye using simple fermentation techniques that required minimal equipment and could be done year-round, with families producing small batches at home or purchasing larger quantities from local brewers who sold their products in wooden casks, clay jugs, or earthenware pots that were passed around during meals, shared among workers, or stored for later use. And because beer contained alcohol, it was considered safer than water in many cases, as the fermentation process killed harmful bacteria and made it less likely to cause illness, though it still carried risks, especially when brewed in unsanitary conditions or left to sit too long without proper storage. Wine was less common and more expensive, and it was primarily consumed by wealthier households, religious institutions, or those who lived near vineyards or trade routes that brought it from distant lands, and it was often diluted with water to reduce its strength and make it more palatable, especially for children, the elderly, or those who were not accustomed to drinking it regularly. And although it was seen as a luxury item, it was also used in religious ceremonies, medical treatments, and social gatherings, reinforcing the idea that certain drinks were associated with status, piety, or celebration rather than everyday consumption. In addition to these beverages, some people drank herbal infusions, fruit juices, or fermented milk-based drinks like sour milk or kefir, which were believed to have health benefits or provide relief from digestive issues, and these were often prepared at home using ingredients that could be gathered from nearby fields, gardens, or markets, though they were not always available in large quantities and were often consumed only when other options were limited or when specific needs arose, such as treating a cold, easing stomach pain, or providing nourishment to sick or weak individuals. The preparation of drinks was usually simple and repetitive, involving boiling grains, soaking fruits, fermenting liquids, or mixing ingredients together in open containers that allowed air to circulate and promote the growth of yeast. And since there were no precise measurements, timers, or temperature controls, the results varied widely depending on the skill of the person making the drink, the quality of the ingredients, and the environmental conditions, leading to inconsistencies in taste, strength, and safety that were accepted as part of life rather than avoided or corrected through innovation or experimentation. Drinking was often a communal activity, with people sharing cups, bowls, or bottles during meals, and while this practice helped conserve resources and build social bonds, it also increased the risk of spreading illness, especially in crowded homes or public spaces where hygiene standards were low. And despite this, people continued to drink from the same vessel repeatedly, believing that it was a natural and acceptable way to share food and drink with others, especially within families or close-knit communities where trust and familiarity were strong. The act of drinking was not typically associated with pleasure, excitement, or indulgence, but rather with necessity, tradition, and the need to stay hydrated, warm, or energized throughout the day, and there was little emphasis placed on the taste, aroma, or variety of drinks, as long as they filled the stomach, warmed the body, and did not cause immediate harm. And this practical approach extended to all forms of liquid consumption, whether it was water, beer, wine, or something else, with no expectation of novelty, comfort, or enjoyment beyond basic survival. Religious beliefs also influenced how people drank, as the Christian Church sometimes encouraged moderation, self-discipline, and abstinence from excessive drinking, especially during fasting periods or when preparing for holy days. And while this rule was not always strictly followed, it reinforced the idea that drinking should be done responsibly and in accordance with spiritual values, rather than for entertainment, excess, or personal gratification, and this attitude was particularly strong among monastic communities, where strict dietary and behavioral codes governed every aspect of life, including the consumption of liquids, and where even wine was treated as a sacred offering rather than a casual beverage. Over time, small changes occurred in the types of drinks available and the ways they were consumed, as new ingredients, techniques, or cultural influences spread through trade, travel, or migration. But these changes were slow and often adapted to fit existing customs rather than replacing them entirely, so the overall pattern of drinking remained largely unchanged, with most people continuing to rely on the same basic beverages that had been used for generations, and no one expected anything different, because the rhythm of life was shaped by routine, necessity, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort, novelty, or indulgence. And this quiet endurance defined the way people experienced food and drink in medieval Europe, where the value of a meal or a drink was measured not by its taste or complexity, but by its ability to keep the body strong, the mind clear, and the soul in balance with the rhythms of nature, faith, and duty. Spices, sweeteners, and rare ingredients in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, saffron, and cloves were not commonly used in everyday cooking, and they were considered rare, expensive, and mostly available to wealthier households or religious institutions that had access to trade networks bringing them from distant lands. And while some people may have encountered these ingredients through merchants, travelers, or religious figures who brought them from the East, they were rarely incorporated into regular meals due to their high cost, limited availability, and the lack of knowledge about how to use them effectively in local cuisine. And even when they were used, it was usually in small quantities and only for special occasions or medicinal purposes rather than as a means of enhancing flavor or adding variety to daily food. Pepper, one of the most sought-after spices, was particularly prized for its ability to add heat and depth to dishes, but it was so costly that it was often reserved for the wealthy, who used it to season meats, stews, and sauces in ways that made their meals stand out from those of ordinary people. And while some lower-class individuals might have been given a tiny amount of pepper as part of a gift or trade, it was never used in large quantities or on a regular basis, and its presence in a meal was more of a status symbol than a practical addition to flavor. Cinnamon, another highly valued spice, was believed to have medicinal properties and was sometimes added to drinks, porridges, or breads to improve digestion or provide warmth, but it was also seen as a luxury item that could be used sparingly to make a meal feel more refined or sophisticated. And this perception reinforced the idea that spices were not meant for common consumption but rather for those who could afford to indulge in them without concern for cost or scarcity. Saffron, known for its vibrant color and strong aroma, was even rarer than pepper or cinnamon, and it was primarily used in religious or ceremonial contexts, where it was believed to have symbolic significance or spiritual value, and although it was occasionally added to soups or stews to give them a golden hue, it was never used in large amounts or with any regularity, as its price was so high that it was considered a treasure rather than a simple ingredient. Cloves, though less commonly used than the others, were similarly expensive and difficult to obtain, and they were often associated with health benefits, especially for treating toothaches or digestive issues, which led to their occasional use in remedies or herbal preparations rather than in everyday cooking, and this further emphasized the idea that spices were not just for flavor but also for their perceived healing properties, reinforcing the belief that certain ingredients had powers beyond their taste or texture. In addition to spices, sweeteners such as honey, dried fruits, and sugar were also relatively uncommon in most diets, and while honey was more accessible than sugar, it was still considered a valuable commodity that was used sparingly, often reserved for special occasions, medicinal uses, or the preparation of desserts that were not commonly eaten by the general population, and even then, the amount used was minimal, as excess sweetness was not seen as desirable or necessary, and there was little emphasis on creating rich or indulgent flavors in everyday meals, which were typically focused on filling the stomach, providing energy, and maintaining health rather than satisfying cravings or offering pleasure. Dried fruits like figs, dates, and raisins were occasionally used to add a touch of sweetness to porridges, breads, or stews, especially during times of scarcity or when fresh fruit was unavailable, and they were often stored in small quantities and used sparingly to avoid spoilage, but their role in daily meals was limited, and they were not seen as essential components of the diet, but rather as occasional additions that could enhance the texture or complexity of a dish without changing its overall character. Sugar, on the other hand, was extremely rare and almost exclusively used by the wealthy, who imported it from the Middle East or the Mediterranean regions where it was produced in small quantities, and even then, it was often mixed with other ingredients like wine, honey, or spices to create elaborate pastries or sweetened drinks that were consumed only by those who could afford them, and for most people, the idea of eating something purely for its sweetness was foreign, as the primary goal of food was to provide sustenance, not to satisfy desires or create pleasure, and this mindset extended to all aspects of diet, where simplicity, necessity, and tradition took precedence over experimentation, indulgence, or novelty. The use of rare ingredients was also influenced by religious beliefs, as the Christian Church sometimes discouraged the excessive use of spices or sweeteners, viewing them as signs of greed, luxury, or moral weakness, and while this rule was not always strictly enforced, it reinforced the idea that food should be plain, humble, and unadorned, reflecting the values of piety, discipline, and self-control that were central to many people's way of life, and this attitude was particularly strong among monastic communities, where strict dietary regulations governed what could be eaten and how it should be prepared, and where even the smallest amount of spice or sugar was treated with caution and restraint. Over time, small changes occurred in the types of ingredients available and the ways they were used. As trade routes expanded, new goods entered Europe, and cultural influences spread through contact with other regions, but these changes were gradual and often adapted to fit existing customs rather than replacing them entirely, so the overall pattern of using rare ingredients remained largely unchanged, with most people continuing to rely on the same basic foods that had been used for generations, and no one expected anything different, because the rhythm of life was shaped by routine, necessity, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort, novelty, or indulgence, and this quiet endurance defined the way people experienced food in medieval Europe, where the value of a meal or an ingredient was measured not by its richness or complexity, but by its ability to keep the body strong, the mind clear, and the soul in balance with the rhythms of nature. Faith and duty. Cooking methods and kitchen routines across regions in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400. Cooking methods varied depending on location, available resources, and the size of the household, but they were generally simple, repetitive, and focused on practicality rather than complexity or creativity. And while some regions had access to more advanced tools or techniques, most people relied on basic methods that required minimal equipment, fuel, and time, and these methods were passed down through generations as part of a shared cultural heritage that emphasized survival, tradition, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort or novelty. Boiling was the most common cooking method, as it required only a pot, a fire, and water, and it allowed for the preparation of soups, stews, porridges, and other dishes that could be made with whatever ingredients were available at the time, and since boiling was relatively safe, efficient, and easy to manage, it was used for nearly every meal, regardless of whether the food was meat, vegetables, grains, or fish, and this consistency helped maintain a sense of order and predictability in daily life, where meals followed a familiar pattern and rarely deviated from what had been done before. Roasting was another method used, especially in larger households or communal settings such as monasteries, castles, or market towns, where fires were kept burning for long periods and large pieces of meat could be cooked over open flames using spits, hooks, or metal rods that turned slowly to ensure even cooking. And although this technique required more fuel and attention than boiling, it was often used for special occasions, religious festivals, or when there was enough food to justify the effort, and the resulting dishes were usually served in large portions to groups of people who gathered around the fire to eat together, reinforcing the idea that food was not just about nourishment but also about community, sharing, and social interaction. Baking was less common in everyday cooking, especially in rural areas where ovens were rare or difficult to maintain, and it was typically reserved for bread, pastries, or specific dishes that required heat to be evenly distributed over a long period. And while some families had access to small clay or stone ovens, many relied on communal baking facilities located in villages, churches, or marketplaces, where residents brought their dough on designated days and waited for it to be baked in. Shared ovens that were heated by wood fires and maintained by experienced bakers who adjusted temperatures based on experience rather than precise measurements, and this system ensured that everyone had access to fresh bread, though it also meant that meals were prepared on a schedule rather than on demand, and no one expected immediate results or personal convenience. The use of firewood was a constant concern, as it was needed for cooking, heating, and lighting, and it had to be collected manually from nearby forests, fields, or markets, where it was sold in bundles or sacks, and since fuel was expensive and limited, people often conserved it by preparing large batches of food at once and reusing leftovers over several days, which meant that many meals were reheated, simmered, or eaten cold, and this practice contributed to a slow, deliberate pace of eating that was closely tied to the rhythms of daily life, where work, rest, and meals followed predictable patterns without much variation or spontaneity. Cooking tools were simple and often made from materials that were readily available, such as wooden spoons, iron pots, clay bowls, and stone grinding stones, and while some households had access to knives, forks, or ladles, these items were usually shared among family members or used for multiple purposes, and there was little emphasis on individual utensils or specialized equipment, as the goal was to complete the task efficiently rather than to make the process more comfortable or convenient. And this approach reflected a broader cultural mindset that valued simplicity, endurance, and the ability to adapt to hardship rather than to seek out luxury or ease. Cleaning and maintenance of kitchen spaces were also minimal, with no modern conveniences like dishwashers, sinks, or soap, and most people relied on natural water sources such as rivers, wells, or rainwater to wash their hands, bowls, and cooking vessels, and after meals, they wiped their hands on cloths, grass, or their own clothing, and swept crumbs off the floor with brooms made from bundled twigs tied to sticks. And while this level of cleanliness may seem low by modern standards, it was considered sufficient for the time, as there was little understanding of germs or hygiene beyond basic practices like keeping fires lit to prevent smoke buildup and avoiding eating directly from the ground, which was seen as unclean and potentially dangerous. Meals were often eaten in shared spaces, with no separate dining rooms or private tables, and people sat on wooden benches, stools, or the floor, passing bowls and cups from one person to another without concern for individual portions or hygiene, and since there were no proper chairs, tables, or plates, food was placed on thick slices of stale bread called trenchers, which absorbed juices and were later given to animals or the poor after the meal ended, and this practice saved time and effort. and cleaning while also reducing waste, as nothing went unused and even the remnants of meals served a purpose in feeding livestock or supporting the needy, which aligned with religious teachings about charity and humility. The act of cooking itself was repetitive and time-consuming, involving hours of kneading dough, watching pots, cleaning tools, and managing fires, and women and children bore most of this responsibility, passing down knowledge about consistency, rising times, oven heat, and storage methods through observation and practice rather than written instruction, since literacy was rare and cookbooks did not exist for common households. And over time, small changes occurred in how food was prepared and consumed, as new techniques, tools, or influences entered local communities. But these shifts happened so slowly that individuals might live their entire lives without noticing any meaningful difference in the way they cooked or ate, and this quiet continuity provided a sense of stability in a world where change was often dangerous, unwelcome, and best avoided whenever possible. For most people, the experience of cooking was unremarkable and forgettable, blending into the background of daily life like breathing or walking, and no one remembered exactly what they had cooked yesterday or expected anything different tomorrow, because the rhythm of meals was governed by necessity, tradition, and the slow turning of the seasons rather than choice, desire, or innovation. And this quiet endurance defined the way people lived and ate in medieval Europe, where satisfaction came not from richness or variety but from continuity, repetition, and the simple act of surviving another day without hunger. Seasonal changes and the slow evolution of taste preferences in the daily lives of people living in Europe during the years between 1300 and 1400, the experience of eating was closely tied to the changing seasons, and the availability of food fluctuated with the weather, the growth of crops, and the movement of animals. And while this pattern was consistent across most regions, it shaped the way people approached meals, prepared food, and thought about taste, with each season bringing its own set of challenges, opportunities, and routines that influenced what was eaten and how it was consumed. And although there was little variation in the basic ingredients used or the methods of preparation, the rhythm of life was dictated by the natural cycle of planting, harvesting, storing, and consuming, which created a sense of continuity and predictability that defined the way people lived and ate. Spring brought the first signs of renewal, with fresh greens, herbs, and young plants becoming available after the long winter months when food had been limited to dried grains, preserved meats, and stored vegetables. And as the days grew longer and the temperature warmed, people began to look forward to the return of fresh produce that could be gathered from fields, forests, and gardens. And although these early spring foods were often small, bitter, or difficult to prepare, they were welcomed as a welcome change from the monotonous diet of the previous months, reinforcing the idea that variety, even if minimal, was a sign of hope, abundance, and the promise of better times ahead. Summer offered more options, with fruits, berries, and vegetables reaching their peak, and for the first time in months, people could enjoy the sweetness of apples, pears, plums, and cherries, as well as the crispness of lettuce, cucumbers, and radishes. And while these items were not always abundant or easy to store, they provided a refreshing contrast to the heavier, more filling meals of earlier seasons. And this shift in diet helped maintain energy levels, improve digestion, and offer a brief respite from the repetitive nature of daily meals, though even these changes were subtle and did not significantly alter the overall structure of eating habits, which remained focused on necessity, tradition, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort or novelty. Autumn was a time of preparation, as families gathered and stored the last harvests before the cold weather set in, and the focus shifted from enjoying fresh food to ensuring that enough supplies were available to last through the winter months, and this meant that many meals became simpler, less varied, and more reliant on dried legumes, preserved meats, and root vegetables that could be kept for long periods without spoiling. And although this period of scarcity was often difficult, it was also seen as a natural part of life, where survival depended on careful planning, resourcefulness, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. And this mindset reinforced the idea that food was not just about taste or enjoyment but about endurance, responsibility, and the quiet acceptance of hardship. Winter, however, was the most challenging season, when the availability of fresh food dropped dramatically, and people relied heavily on stored supplies, occasional hunting, and charity from wealthier neighbors or church-supported kitchens to survive until the next growing season. And during these months, meals became even more repetitive, consisting of the same porridge, bread, and soup day after day with only slight variations based on what remained in storage, and this monotony was accepted as normal, unchangeable, and part of the natural order of life, where the focus was on surviving rather than indulging, and the idea of flavor was not linked to richness, complexity, or excitement but to familiarity, warmth, and fullness, and a piece of slightly stale bread dipped in thin soup was considered satisfying not because it tasted good in any exciting way but because it filled the stomach, required no chewing effort if softened first, and reminded the eater of countless other meals, just like it, that had sustained them through childhood, adulthood, and old age, in a cycle of quiet repetition that defined the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. Despite the challenges of seasonal changes, the overall pattern of eating remained remarkably consistent, with few significant shifts in taste preferences, cooking methods, or dietary habits over the course of the century, and this stability reflected broader cultural values that emphasized tradition, simplicity, and the acceptance of limitation rather than the pursuit of comfort, novelty, or indulgence. And this quiet endurance defined the way people experienced food in medieval Europe, where the value of a meal was measured not by its taste or complexity, but by its ability to keep the body strong, the mind clear, and the soul in balance with the rhythms of nature, faith, and duty. And even as the world around them changed slowly over time, the way people ate remained rooted in routine, necessity, and the unspoken understanding that survival was more important than satisfaction, and that the act of eating was not about pleasure or excitement, but about sustenance, endurance, and the simple, quiet continuation of life, one meal at a time. The island of Lesbos lies in the Aegean Sea, to the east of mainland Greece, and in the year 500 BCE it was one of the most well-known and culturally rich places in the ancient world. This island was famous not only for its vineyards and olive groves but also for the unique way of life practiced by the women who lived there. Unlike in many other parts of Greece, where women were often kept separate from public life and had little freedom, on Lesbos women were given more space to grow, to learn, and to express their emotions in ways that were not always accepted elsewhere. Lesbos was a place where women could study poetry, music, and dance, and where they could form deep emotional connections with one another. These connections were not seen as unusual or wrong, but rather as a natural part of life. In fact, the term lesbian comes from the name of this island, because it was here that women were known to love each other in a way that went beyond friendship. Over time, this kind of love became known as lesbian love, and it was first recorded in the writings of poets and historians who lived during this period. The largest and most important city on the island was Mytilene, which was home to many wealthy families, teachers, poets, and musicians. Life in Mytilene was peaceful compared to other Greek cities, where wars and political struggles were common. On Lesbos, more attention was given to culture, music, and poetry than to politics or military affairs. This peaceful environment allowed women to develop their talents and to build strong relationships with one another. In the homes of Lesbos, mothers played a central role in raising and educating their children. While boys were often sent to study with male teachers or to learn from their fathers, girls were taught by women who were not only mothers but also scholars, poets, and mentors. These women created a space where young girls could grow up feeling safe, valued, and free to explore their emotions. This kind of education was rare in the ancient world, and it made Lesbos a special place for women. One of the most important parts of life on Lesbos was the tradition of women's schools. These were not like the schools we know today, but rather communities where young girls lived together with their female teachers. In these schools, girls learned to sing, to dance, to play musical instruments, and to write poetry. They also formed deep friendships with one another, and some of these friendships turned into something more, a kind of love that was spiritual, emotional, and sometimes even physical. The most famous teacher and poet of Lesbos was Sappho. She lived in Mytilene around 600 BCE, and her poetry was filled with deep feelings of love and longing for other women. Her words were powerful, and they described a kind of love that was not often written about in the ancient world. Because of her, the island of Lesbos became known as the place where women could love each other openly and without shame. Sappho's poetry was not only beautiful but also deeply personal. She wrote about the pain of separation, the joy of being with someone you love, and the deep emotional bonds that could form between two women. Her poems were often sung with music, and they were performed in gatherings where women would come together to share their thoughts and feelings. These gatherings were a way for women to connect with each other and to express parts of themselves that were not always accepted in the outside world. On Lesbos, women were not afraid to show their feelings for one another. They wrote letters, gave gifts, and spent time together in quiet places where they could talk and share their lives. These relationships were seen as a normal and natural part of life, and they were not considered to be against the rules of society. In fact, many people believe that these relationships helped women become stronger, more creative, and more connected to the world around them. Men on the island knew about these relationships, but they did not interfere with them. Men were often busy with politics, trade, and war, and they left the world of women to be what it was. Some men even admired the way women could express their feelings so openly, and they tried to write poetry like the women of Lesbos. In this way, the influence of the island spread beyond its borders and reached other parts of Greece. It is important to understand that the love between women on Lesbos was not always romantic in the modern sense. Sometimes it was a deep friendship, sometimes it was a mentorship, and sometimes it was a bond that lasted a lifetime. But in every case, it was a way for women to feel close to one another and to share parts of themselves that were not always shared with men or with the outside world. The island of Lesbos became a symbol of women's freedom and emotional depth. It was a place where women could be themselves, where they could learn, grow, and love in ways that were not always possible in other parts of the ancient world. Even after the schools and communities of women disappeared, the memory of Lesbos remained. The name of the island became linked with a special kind of love, and that link has lasted for thousands of years. Today, when we use the word lesbian, we are remembering the island of Lesbos and the women who lived there. Their lives may have been very different from ours, but their feelings were the same. They loved, they felt joy, they felt pain, and they wrote about it in ways that still touch us today. The history of women's love begins with Lesbos, and it continues to grow and change with every new generation. Even though many of Sappho's poems have been lost over time, and even though the island itself has changed, the spirit of Lesbos lives on. It reminds us that love between women is not new, and that it has always been a part of human history. It also reminds us that there are places in the world where people can be free to feel and to love without fear. The culture of Lesbos in 500 BCE was not perfect, and not every woman on the island may have lived the same kind of life. But for many women, especially those who were educated and who lived in the schools and communities of Mytilene, it was a time of great emotional and creative freedom. They were able to express themselves in ways that were rare in the ancient world, and they were able to form deep and lasting bonds with one another. This freedom and this openness to emotion made Lesbos a special place. It was a place where women could explore their feelings, where they could write about love and loss, and where they could live in a way that allowed them to be fully themselves. This is why the island became so important in the history of women's love, and why it continues to be remembered even today. In many ways, the story of women's love begins with Lesbos. It is here that the first written records of love between women appear, and it is here that we can see the earliest examples of how women expressed their feelings for one another. These early examples help us understand how love between women has changed over time, and how it has remained the same in many important ways. The island of Lesbos was not just a place on a map, but a place in the hearts of many women who came after. It was a place where women could be free, where they could find love, and where they could leave behind a legacy that would last for thousands of years. That legacy is still with us today, and it reminds us that love between women has always been a part of the human story. On the island of Lesbos in the year 500 BCE, education for girls was not like education in other parts of Greece. In many Greek cities, girls were not taught to read or write, and they were not given the chance to study music, poetry, or dance. But on Lesbos, things were different. Here, girls were taught by women who were not only mothers and teachers, but also poets, musicians, and leaders in their own right. These women created a special kind of learning environment that allowed girls to grow in ways that were rare in the ancient world. The schools for girls on Lesbos were more than just places to learn reading and writing. They were communities where young women lived together, shared their lives, and formed deep emotional bonds with one another. These schools were often run by older women who had studied poetry and music themselves and who now passed on their knowledge to the next generation. The girls who came to these schools were not only students, but also friends, and sometimes even lovers. The relationships formed in these schools were a big part of what made Lesbos unique. One of the most important parts of education on Lesbos was music. Girls were taught to play instruments like the lyre and the flute, and they learned to sing songs that were passed down through generations. Music was not just a form of entertainment, but also a way to express feelings and emotions. Many of the songs sung in these schools were written by women, and they often spoke about love, longing, and the deep connections that could form between two women. Poetry was also a central part of life in these schools. Girls were taught to write poems about their feelings, their dreams, and their relationships with others. Some of these poems were very personal, and they described the joy of being close to someone, or the sadness of being separated from them. Others were more formal and were meant to be sung in groups, often with music and dance. These poems helped to create a sense of community among the girls and gave them a way to share their inner lives with each other. Dance was another important part of education on Lesbos. Girls learned to move their bodies in graceful ways, and they often danced in circles or lines, holding hands and singing together. These dances were not just for fun, but were also a way to build trust and closeness between the girls. Dancing together created a sense of unity and made the girls feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves. It was a way to connect with each other physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The teachers in these schools were not like teachers in modern schools. They were more like mentors and mothers, guiding the girls not only in their studies, but also in their personal growth. These teachers often lived with the girls, ate with them, and spent time with them outside of lessons. This close relationship allowed the girls to feel safe and supported, and it helped them develop strong bonds with the women who taught them. In many cases, the relationship between a teacher and her students was more than just educational. It was also emotional and sometimes even romantic. Teachers would write poems about their students, and students would write poems in return. These poems often spoke of admiration, love, and the deep connection that could form between a woman and her pupil. This kind of relationship was not seen as strange or wrong, but rather as a natural part of life on Lesbos. the schools on Lesbos were not only places of learning, but also places of emotional growth. Girls came to these schools at a young age, often around the time they began to become women. During their time there, they were taught not only how to read and write, but also how to feel, how to love, and how to express themselves in ways that were accepted and even celebrated. This kind of education helped them grow into strong, confident women who were able to make their own choices and live their lives with purpose. The influence of these schools was not limited to the island of Lesbos. Many of the girls who studied there came from other parts of Greece, and when they returned home, they brought with them the ideas and values they had learned. Some of them continued to write poetry, some of them taught their own daughters, and others simply carried with them the memory of the deep friendships and love they had experienced while living on the island. In this way, the culture of Lesbos spread far beyond its shores. The schools for women on Lesbos were not just for the wealthy or the noble. While many of the girls who attended came from rich families, there were also girls from more modest backgrounds who were given the chance to study and grow in this special environment. This made the schools on Lesbos more open and inclusive than many other educational institutions of the time, where only the sons of the rich were given the chance to learn and to rise in society. The structure of these schools was simple, but effective. Each school had a head teacher, usually an older woman who had studied under another teacher when she was young. She was responsible for guiding the students, teaching them, and helping them develop their talents. The students lived together in the same house or building, and they followed a daily routine that included lessons, meals, music, dance, and time for rest and reflection. Because the girls lived together, they formed very close relationships with one another. Some of these relationships were like friendships, others were more like family, and some were deeper still. These relationships were not hidden or seen as wrong, but were instead considered a normal and important part of growing up. The girls were encouraged to care for each other, to support each other, and to share their lives in ways that were meaningful and lasting. The emotional bonds formed in these schools often lasted for many years, and sometimes even for a lifetime. Even after the girls left the school and returned to their homes, they kept in touch with each other through letters and poems. Some of these letters have survived to this day, and they offer a rare glimpse into the inner lives of women in the ancient world. They show that women were capable of deep love, strong friendships, and lasting emotional connections, even in a time when their voices were often unheard. The schools on Lesbos were not just places for girls to learn. They were also places for women to find themselves, to discover who they were, and to explore their feelings in a way that was not always possible in the outside world. This kind of freedom was rare in the ancient world, and it made Lesbos a special place for women who wanted to live full and meaningful lives. Over time, the schools on Lesbos became known throughout Greece, and many people came to the island to see them for themselves. Some came to study, others came to write about them, and still others came simply out of curiosity. The island became a center of culture and learning, and it was known for its women, its poetry, and its unique way of life. Even though the schools on Lesbos eventually disappeared, their legacy lived on. The idea that women could learn, grow, and love each other in a way that was accepted and even celebrated continued to influence people for many years to come. And even today, when we think about the history of women's education and the history of women's love, we remember the island of Lesbos and the special schools that once existed there. In many ways, the schools on Lesbos were ahead of their time. They offered women a chance to be more than just wives and mothers, and they gave them the tools to express themselves, to think for themselves, and to build deep and lasting relationships with other women. These schools helped shape the lives of many women, and they left behind a legacy that continues to inspire people even now. The women who lived and studied on Lesbos were not just students. They were poets, musicians, dancers, and thinkers. They were women who dared to feel deeply, to love openly, and to live in a way that was true to themselves. And because of them, the island of Lesbos became a place that will never be forgotten. Among all the women who lived on the island of Lesbos in the year 500 BCE, none was more famous than Sappho. She was not only a poet, but also a teacher, a mentor, and a woman whose words reached far beyond her own time. Her poetry was filled with emotion, and it described a kind of love that was rarely spoken of so openly in the ancient world. Because of her, the island of Lesbos became known as the place where women could love each other in ways that were deep, meaningful, and beautiful. Sappho lived in the city of Mytilene, which was the largest and most important city on Lesbos. She was born around the year 630 BCE, and she lived during a time when music, poetry, and dance were highly valued. She was not a queen or a noblewoman, but she was respected by many people because of her talent and the way she expressed her feelings through words. Her poems were often sung with music, and they were performed in gatherings where women came together to share their lives and emotions. Sappho was known for the way she wrote about love, and especially for the way she wrote about love between women. Her words were full of longing, joy, sadness, and hope, and they showed that women could feel deeply about each other. Some of her poems were about the happiness of being close to someone, while others were about the pain of being separated from the one you loved. These feelings were not always easy to express, but Sappho found a way to put them into words that could be understood and felt by others. She was also a teacher, and many young women came to study with her. In her school, girls learned to sing, to dance, and to write poetry, just like in other women's schools on the island. But Sappho's school was special because of the way she connected with her students. She wrote poems about them, and they wrote poems about her. These poems were not just lessons or exercises, they were expressions of real feelings, and they helped create a bond between teacher and student that was very strong. Some people believe that Sappho's relationships with her students were more than just educational. They believed that she loved some of her students in a way that was not only spiritual or emotional, but also romantic. This idea was not considered shocking or wrong in her time, especially on Lesbos, where love between women was seen as a natural part of life. But after her death, some people tried to change the way she was remembered, and they tried to make her seem less important or even controversial. Despite these attempts, Sappho's poetry survived, and it continued to be read and admired by many people. Her words were copied by hand, passed from one person to another, and studied by poets and scholars for centuries. Some of her poems were lost over time, but even the pieces that remain give us a powerful sense of who she was and what she believed. Her writing was not only beautiful, but also deeply human, and it spoke to the heart in a way that few other poets could. Because of her, the word lesbian came to be used to describe love between women. The name of the island where she lived became linked with this kind of love, and that link has lasted for thousands of years. Even today, when we use the word lesbian, we are remembering the island of Lesbos and the woman who made it famous. Her influence was not only on the women who lived at the same time as her, but also on generations that came long after she was gone. Sappho's poetry was often written in a form that was very personal. She used the first person, and she wrote about her own feelings and experiences. This made her poems feel close and real, as if she was speaking directly to the reader. Many of her poems were about women she loved, and they described the way she felt about them in a way that was honest and powerful. She wrote about the joy of being near someone, the pain of losing them, and the deep longing that comes with love. She also wrote about the role of women in society, and about the ways in which women could be strong, creative, and full of emotion. She believed that women had voices that deserved to be heard, and she used her own voice to speak for them. Her poetry gave women a way to see themselves as important and valuable, and it helped them understand that their feelings were real and worth expressing. Sappho was not the only poet on Lesbos, but she was the most famous. Other women wrote poetry, and some of them were well known in their own time, but none of them reached the same level of fame or influence as she did. Her name was known across Greece, and even men who lived in other parts of the country admired her work. Some of them tried to write like her, and others wrote about her, trying to understand who she was and what her poetry meant. Over time, stories about Sappho's life began to appear. Some of them said that she had been married, and that she had a daughter. Others said that she had fallen in love with a man named Phaon and had thrown herself from a cliff when he did not return her love. These stories were probably not true, but they became part of the way people remembered her. They showed how deeply her life and her poetry affected people, even long after she was gone. Sappho's influence did not end with her death. Her poetry continued to be read, copied, and studied by people who wanted to understand her words and the world she came from. Her name was mentioned by many writers in the centuries that followed, and even though most of her poems were lost, the ones that survived were enough to show how great a poet she was. The island of Lesbos became known because of her, and her name became part of the history of women's love. She was not the first woman to love another woman, and she was not the last, but she was one of the first to write about it in a way that was honest and powerful. Because of her, the world remembered that women could love each other deeply, and that their feelings were just as real and important as those of men. Even now, thousands of years later, people still read Sappho's poetry and feel moved by it. Her words still speak to the heart, and they still help people understand what it means to love and to feel deeply. She was a woman who lived a long time ago, in a world very different from ours, but her voice still echoes through time, reminding us that love between women has always been a part of the human story. Sappho's life may have been short, but her legacy is long. Her poetry gave women a way to express their feelings, and it helped shape the way people think about love, especially love between women. She was not just a poet, she was a teacher, a mentor, a leader, and a symbol of what women could be when they were free to speak, to feel, and to love. The story of Sappho is the story of a woman who changed the way people thought about love and poetry. It is the story of a teacher who touched the lives of many young women, and of a poet whose words have lasted for thousands of years. It is also the story of the island of Lesbos, and of the special place it holds in the history of women's love. On the island of Lesbos in the year 500 BCE, friendship between women was not just common, it was an important part of daily life. Women lived close to each other, worked together, learned from each other, and often shared their homes and their lives. These friendships were not only about companionship, but also about trust, support, and deep emotional connection. In many ways, these friendships were as strong as any other kind of relationship, and sometimes they were even stronger than marriage. In other parts of Greece, women were often kept apart from each other, especially once they were married. They were expected to stay in their own homes, to take care of their husbands and children, and to avoid forming close bonds with other women. But on Lesbos, things were different. Women were encouraged to spend time together, to talk, to share their feelings, and to build lasting relationships with one another. These relationships were not seen as strange or wrong, but as a normal and natural part of life. The people of Lesbos believed that women could feel deeply for each other, and that these feelings could be just as real and powerful as the feelings between a man and a woman. Some friendships were purely emotional, while others included physical closeness. But in most cases, the exact nature of these relationships was not discussed in detail. Instead, what mattered was the bond between the women, the way they cared for each other, the way they supported each other through hard times, and the way they shared their lives. Because of this, many women on Lesbos formed groups or small communities where they lived and worked together. These groups were not always made up of just two people, sometimes they included several women who shared a house, who ate together, and who spent most of their time in each other's company. These groups were not seen as unusual, and they were accepted by the people who lived on the island. In fact, many people believed that living in such a group helped women become stronger, more confident, and more connected to the world around them. Men on the island were aware of these friendships, but they did not see them as a threat. They understood that women had their own lives, their own ways of forming bonds, and their own ways of expressing love. Some men even believed that these friendships helped women become better mothers, better wives, and better members of society. Others simply ignored them, because they were focused on their own lives, their own work, and their own relationships with other men. In many cases, the friendships between women on Lesbos were long-lasting. Some lasted for years, and some even lasted for a lifetime. Women who were close to each other often stayed in touch even when they were separated by distance. They wrote letters, they sent gifts, and they visited each other when they could. These friendships were not just about spending time together, they were about sharing life, about growing together, and about supporting each other through the changes that came with time. The people of Lesbos believed that friendship was one of the most important things in life. They believed that people needed each other, that they needed to feel close to others, and that they needed to have someone they could trust and rely on. This belief was especially strong among women, who often had fewer choices and fewer freedoms than men. For many women, having close friends was one of the few ways they could feel truly free and truly themselves. Because of this, women on Lesbos were not afraid to show their feelings for each other. They hugged, they held hands, they kissed each other on the cheek, and they often lived in the same house. These actions were not seen as unusual, and they were not considered to be against the rules of society. Instead, they were seen as natural expressions of love and care, and they were accepted as a normal part of life. Some people from other parts of Greece did not understand this way of life. When they visited Lesbos, they sometimes wrote about what they saw, and they described the relationships between women in ways that were not always accurate. Some of them said that the women of Lesbos were different from other women, that they were more emotional, more passionate, and more connected to each other than women in other places. Others used these descriptions to make fun of the women of Lesbos, or to suggest that their way of life was wrong. But the women of Lesbos did not let these opinions change the way they lived. They continued to form friendships, to live together, and to support each other in the ways they always had. They believed that their relationships were real, that they were important, and that they had a place in the world. And even though some people outside of Lesbos did not understand or accept these relationships, the women who lived there knew that they were not alone. Over time, the friendships between women on Lesbos became part of the island's identity. They were one of the things that made Lesbos different from other places in the ancient world, and they were one of the reasons why the island became known for its women. These friendships were not just about love, they were also about learning, about growing, and about finding a place where women could be themselves without fear. The idea of female friendship on Lesbos was not only about personal relationships, it was also about community. Women worked together, they raised children together, and they shared their lives in ways that helped build a strong and connected society. This sense of community was one of the reasons why life on Lesbos was so peaceful compared to other parts of Greece, where men often fought wars and where women were kept apart from each other. Even after the island changed and the ways of life on Lesbos began to shift, the memory of these friendships remained. The idea that women could form deep and lasting bonds with each other continued to live on, and it became part of the larger story of women's love and friendship throughout history. The women of Lesbos were not the first to form such bonds, and they were not the last, but they were among the first to live in a place where those bonds were accepted and celebrated. In many ways, the friendships between women on Lesbos were ahead of their time. They showed that women could be more than just wives and mothers, they could be friends, partners, and even lovers. They showed that women could live together, care for each other, and build lives that were full of meaning and emotion. And they showed that love between women was not something new or strange, but something that had always been a part of the human experience. On the island of Lesbos in the year 500 BCE, women took part in many rituals and ceremonies that marked the different stages of their lives. These rituals were not only important for religious reasons, but also for personal and emotional growth. They helped women understand who they were, what their place was in the world, and how they could connect with other women in deep and meaningful ways. These ceremonies were often filled with music, poetry, and dance, and they gave women a chance to celebrate their lives together. One of the most important rituals for young girls was the ceremony that marked the change from childhood to womanhood. This was a time when a girl was no longer seen as a child, but as someone who was ready to take on new roles in society. The ceremony often included a special dress, a new hairstyle, and gifts from family and friends. It was also a time when older women would teach the girl what it meant to be a woman, what she could expect in the years ahead, and how she could find strength and support among other women. These ceremonies were not only about growing up, but also about forming new connections. Many girls were introduced to the women who would become their teachers, mentors, and sometimes even lovers. These women helped guide them through the changes in their bodies and their lives, and they offered them a sense of belonging that was very strong. In many cases, the bond between a young girl and her older mentor was one of the most important relationships she would ever have. Women on Lesbos also took part in religious ceremonies that were led by other women. Unlike in many other parts of Greece, where men were often the main leaders in religious life, on Lesbos women played a central role in worship and spiritual practice. They sang songs to the gods, especially to goddesses like Aphrodite, who was believed to protect love and beauty. These songs were often written by women themselves, and they spoke about love, longing, and the deep emotional bonds that could form between two people. Dance was an important part of many of these ceremonies. Women danced in circles, holding hands and moving together in a way that created a strong sense of unity. These dances were not only beautiful to watch, but also deeply emotional. They helped women feel connected to each other, to the gods, and to the world around them. Some of these dances were performed in temples, while others took place in open fields or near the sea, where the wind and the waves could carry the music and the voices of the women. In many cases, these ceremonies were held in special places that were only for women. These places were like small temples or gathering spaces where women could come together to talk, to sing, to dance, and to share their feelings. These spaces were not open to men, and they gave women a chance to be themselves without fear of being judged or misunderstood. Here, they could talk about their dreams, their fears, and the things they hoped for in life. The women who led these ceremonies were often older and more experienced. They were respected for their wisdom, their knowledge of poetry and music, and their ability to guide younger women through the changes in their lives. These leaders were not only teachers, but also spiritual guides, and they played an important role in helping women understand themselves and their place in the world. Some of these ceremonies were held during special times of the year, like the changing of the seasons or the full moon. These times were believed to be powerful, and they were often seen as moments when the connection between the human world and the divine was strongest. During these ceremonies, women would offer gifts to the gods, sing songs, and perform dances that were meant to bring them closer to the divine and to each other. These rituals were not only about religion or tradition, they were also about personal growth and emotional healing. Many women came to these ceremonies when they were going through difficult times, like the loss of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or the start of a new chapter in their lives. These ceremonies gave them a way to express their feelings, to find support among other women, and to feel a sense of peace and renewal. The ceremonies on Lesbos were also a way for women to remember the past and to honor the women who had come before them. Many of the songs and poems used in these rituals had been passed down for generations, and they carried with them the voices and emotions of women who had lived long before. These traditions helped women feel connected to their history and to the larger story of women's lives on the island. Because of these rituals, women on Lesbos were able to build strong communities that were based on trust, support, and shared experience. These communities were not only places where women could learn and grow, but also places where they could find comfort, friendship, and love. The rituals and ceremonies that took place on the island helped create a sense of belonging that was very deep and very real. Even though many of these rituals have been lost over time, the idea behind them has not. The need for women to come together, to share their lives, and to support each other is still very much a part of the human experience. And in many ways, the women of Lesbos were among the first to understand this need and to create spaces where it could be fulfilled. The rituals and ceremonies on Lesbos were more than just traditions, they were ways for women to connect with each other, to express their feelings, and to find meaning in their lives. They were moments when women could be free, when they could be themselves, and when they could feel the deep bonds that could form between two people. These rituals helped shape the lives of many women, and they left behind a legacy that continues to inspire people even today. The women who lived on the island of Lesbos in the year 500 BCE left behind many stories, even if those stories were not always written down in full. Some of these stories came to us through the poems of Sappho, while others were passed on by historians, writers, and travelers who visited the island and wrote about what they saw. These stories give us a rare and valuable look into the lives of women who lived long ago, and they help us understand how deeply women could feel for each other during that time. One of the most common ways that women shared their feelings was through poetry. Many women wrote poems about their friends, their teachers, and the people they loved. These poems were often filled with emotion, and they described the joy of being close to someone, the pain of being separated from them, and the deep longing that came with love. Some of these poems were written to be sung, and they were often performed with music and dance, making them even more powerful and moving. Letters were another way that women expressed their feelings. Some of these letters have survived, and they show that women were not afraid to write openly about their emotions. They wrote about missing someone, about wanting to be with them again, and about how much they cared for them. These letters were not always long, but they were always full of feeling, and they give us a glimpse into the personal lives of women who lived more than 2,000 years ago. There were also stories about women who lived together in small groups or communities. These women often shared a house, ate together, and spent most of their time in each other's company. They were not always lovers in the modern sense, but they were close in ways that went beyond friendship. They supported each other, helped each other through hard times, and shared their lives in a way that made them feel like family. Some of these women were teachers and students, and their relationships were very deep. The older women taught the younger ones how to write poetry, how to play music, and how to dance. But they also taught them how to feel, how to love, and how to live in a way that allowed them to be themselves. These relationships were not hidden or seen as wrong, but were instead considered a normal and important part of life on the island. There are also stories of women who left the island and returned to their homes in other parts of Greece. When they left, they often took with them the memories of the friendships and love they had found on Lesbos. Some of them continued to write poetry, some of them taught their daughters what they had learned, and others simply carried the feeling of freedom and connection with them for the rest of their lives. One of the most famous examples of this kind of story is found in the writings of Sappho. Although many of her poems have been lost, the ones that remain give us a strong sense of how deeply she felt for the women around her. She wrote about the women she taught, the women she loved, and the women who had left her and gone away. Her words were full of longing, and they show that even in the ancient world, women could feel the same kinds of emotions that people feel today. Sappho's poetry often spoke about the pain of separation. She wrote about women who had moved away, who had married, or who had simply gone to live somewhere else. She described how hard it was to be apart from them, how much she missed them, and how much she wished they could come back. These poems were not only about love, they were also about loss, and about the deep emotional connections that could form between two people. There were also stories about women who stayed on the island for their whole lives. These women formed long-lasting relationships with other women, and they built lives together in ways that were not always possible in other parts of the world. Some of them lived in the same house for many years, others worked together, and some even raised children together. These women were not always mothers in the traditional sense, but they were still deeply connected to the children around them, and they helped raise and teach them. Because of the way life was structured on Lesbos, women had more freedom than in many other places. They could choose who they wanted to live with, who they wanted to spend their time with, and who they wanted to love. This freedom was not always accepted in other parts of Greece, but on Lesbos it was seen as a natural part of life. Women were allowed to make their own choices, and they were not forced into roles that did not fit them. Some of the women who lived on the island were known for their talent in music and poetry. They wrote songs that were passed down through generations, and they performed in gatherings where women came together to share their lives and emotions. These performances were not only for entertainment, they were also a way for women to express their feelings, to tell their stories, and to connect with each other in a way that was very meaningful. There are also records of women who were remembered long after they had passed away. Their names were written in poems, their lives were described in letters, and their relationships were remembered by the people who had known them. These women were not forgotten, and their stories continued to live on in the words of those who had loved them. The personal stories of women from Lesbos show us that love between women is not a new idea. It has always been a part of human history, and it has always been a part of the way people form relationships and build lives together. These stories help us understand that women have always had the ability to feel deeply, to love openly, and to live in ways that are true to themselves. Even though many of these stories have been lost over time, the ones that remain give us a powerful sense of what life was like for women on the island. They show us that women could be strong, that they could be creative, and that they could form deep and lasting bonds with each other. These stories remind us that the past is not so different from the present, and that the emotions people feel today are the same emotions that people felt long ago. The women of Lesbos were not only poets, musicians, and dancers, they were also lovers, friends, and teachers. They lived full lives, they felt deeply, and they left behind a legacy that continues to inspire people even now. Their stories may be old, but they are still important, and they still have the power to move us and to teach us about the strength of women's love. These stories also remind us that history is not only made by kings, warriors, and men in power, it is also made by ordinary people, by women who lived quiet lives, and by the relationships they formed with each other. The women of Lesbos may not have ruled empires or led armies, but they changed the way people thought about love, and they helped shape the way we understand relationships today. Even now, thousands of years later, we can still hear the voices of these women in the poems that remain, in the letters that were saved, and in the stories that were passed down through time. These voices remind us that women have always had the power to love, to feel, and to live in ways that are true to themselves. And because of them, the island of Lesbos will never be forgotten. On the island of Lesbos in the year 500 BCE, marriage was a part of life for many women, but it was not always the most important part. While most women were expected to marry at some point, especially as they grew older, many of them also formed deep emotional and romantic connections with other women. These relationships were not seen as a replacement for marriage, but rather as something that could exist alongside it. Women could be married to men and still feel love for other women, and this was accepted as a normal part of life on the island. The families of Lesbos understood that women had their own ways of forming bonds and that these bonds could be very strong. Some families even encouraged their daughters to spend time with older women who could teach them about life, love, and poetry. These older women were not just teachers, they were also mentors, friends, and sometimes even lovers. The relationships formed between young women and their mentors were not seen as wrong or unnatural, but as a part of growing up and learning about the world. Marriage on Lesbos was often arranged by families, just as it was in other parts of Greece. Women were usually married at a young age, sometimes as early as 15 or 16, and they were expected to move in with their husband's family after the wedding. But unlike in many other places, where married women were kept apart from other women and were not allowed to form close friendships, on Lesbos women were still able to maintain their relationships with other women even after marriage. Some women continued to live with other women even after they were married. In some cases, they brought their close friends or lovers with them into their new home, and the 3 or more women lived together in a way that was not always common in other parts of the ancient world. These living arrangements were not always sexual, but they were deeply emotional and supportive. The women helped each other raise children, cook, clean, and take care of the household, and they formed a kind of family that was different from the traditional one. The idea of family on Lesbos was not always the same as in other places. While most families were made up of a husband, a wife, and their children, some families on the island included more than one woman. These women were not always married to the same man. Sometimes they were simply close friends or lovers who chose to live together and support each other. This kind of family structure was accepted by the people of Lesbos, and it was seen as a natural way for women to live their lives. Mothers on the island played a central role in raising their children, and they often worked closely with other women to teach their daughters about life, love, and relationships. Some mothers even encouraged their daughters to form close bonds with other women, because they believed that these bonds would help them grow and become stronger people. These bonds were not always romantic, but they were always meaningful, and they helped shape the way women saw themselves and the world around them. Because of this, many women on Lesbos did not see marriage as the only path to happiness or fulfillment. While marriage was important for social and economic reasons, it was not always the place where women found the deepest love or connection. Some women found more meaning in their relationships with other women than in their marriages, and this was accepted as a part of life on the island. Men on Lesbos were aware of these relationships, but they did not always interfere with them. Some men understood that their wives had close friendships with other women, and they did not see these friendships as a threat. Others simply did not care, because they were focused on their own lives, their own work, and their own relationships with other men. In some cases, men even respected the bonds that women formed with each other, and they saw them as a sign of strength and independence. The people of Lesbos believed that women could have more than one kind of love in their lives. They could love their husbands, they could love their children, and they could also love other women. These different kinds of love were not seen as conflicting with each other, but as parts of a full and meaningful life. This belief made the island different from many other places in the ancient world, where women were often expected to love only their husbands and to avoid forming deep emotional bonds with other women. In many cases, the relationships between women lasted longer than marriages. Some women were married only for a short time, while their friendships or romantic relationships with other women lasted for many years, or even for a lifetime. These relationships were not always easy, and they sometimes faced challenges from outside forces, but they were often more lasting and more meaningful than the relationships women had with men. Even though marriage was a part of life for most women on Lesbos, it did not always define who they were. Many women continued to write poetry, to sing, to dance, and to form deep emotional connections with other women long after they were married. Some of them even continued to live in the same communities or schools where they had grown up, and they remained close to the women who had been their friends or lovers since they were young. Because of this, the island of Lesbos became known as a place where women could live full and complex lives. They could be wives, mothers, poets, musicians, and lovers all at once. They could form deep emotional bonds with other women, and they could live in ways that were not always possible in other parts of the ancient world. This freedom and this openness to emotion made Lesbos a special place for women. Even after the island changed and the ways of life on Lesbos began to shift, the memory of these relationships remained. The idea that women could form deep and lasting bonds with each other continued to live on, and it became part of the larger story of women's love and friendship throughout history. The women of Lesbos were not the first to form such bonds, and they were not the last, but they were among the first to live in a place where those bonds were accepted and celebrated. The relationships between women on Lesbos were more than just personal, they were also cultural and historical. They helped shape the way people thought about love, and they gave women a way to express their feelings in a world that often tried to silence them. These relationships showed that women could be more than just wives and mothers, they could be friends, partners, and even lovers. And they showed that love between women was not something new or strange, but something that had always been a part of the human experience. As the island of Lesbos grew in fame, its culture began to spread beyond its shores and reach other parts of the ancient world. The island was known not only for its beautiful landscapes and peaceful way of life, but also for the way women lived and loved in ways that were different from what was common in other parts of Greece. Because of this, many people from other cities and regions came to visit Lesbos, and they returned home with new ideas about women, love, and relationships. One of the main ways that the culture of Lesbos spread was through the poetry of Sappho. Her words were copied by hand and shared among people who loved poetry and music. Her poems were sung in many places, and her name became known far beyond the island. People who had never been to Lesbos still heard of her, and they learned about the island because of her work. Her poetry described a kind of love that was not often written about in other parts of Greece, and it gave people a new way to think about the relationships between women. In many Greek cities, women were not allowed to live freely or to form deep emotional bonds with each other. But the people who visited Lesbos saw that women there could live together, love each other, and express their feelings in ways that were accepted by society. Some of these visitors were men, and some were women, but all of them carried the memory of what they saw back to their own homes. They told stories about the women of Lesbos, and they described how women could live in schools, how they could write poetry about each other, and how they could share their lives in deep and meaningful ways. Over time, these stories helped change the way some people thought about women's relationships. In some places, women began to form closer friendships, and some of them even tried to copy the way women lived on Lesbos. They wrote poems about each other, they formed small groups where they could talk and sing together, and they tried to live in ways that gave them more freedom. These changes were not always accepted, especially in places where men controlled most of society, but they showed that the ideas from Lesbos had the power to influence people even far away. The island was also known for its music and dance, and these arts helped spread its culture to other places. Women from Lesbos sometimes traveled to other cities to perform, and when they did, they brought with them their songs, their dances, and their way of expressing emotions. These performances were not only for entertainment, they were also a way for women to connect with each other and to show that they could feel deeply and express themselves in beautiful ways. The music and dance of Lesbos became popular in other parts of Greece, and they helped people understand more about the island and the women who lived there. Because of the poetry, the music, and the stories that spread from Lesbos, the name of the island became linked with a special kind of love. people began to use the word lesbian to describe love between women, even if they had never been to the island themselves. This word came from the name of the island, and it became a way to talk about a kind of love that was not always easy to describe in other words. Even though many people did not fully understand what life was like on Lesbos, they knew that the island had something to do with women who loved each other in deep and lasting ways. The way people in other places thought about Lesbos was not always the same. Some people admired the island and saw it as a place of freedom and beauty, where women could live in ways that were not possible elsewhere. Others looked at it with curiosity, and some even with suspicion or criticism. There were people who did not agree with the way women lived on the island, and they wrote about it in ways that were not always fair. Some of them said that the women of Lesbos were too emotional, too free, or too different from other women. But even these criticisms showed that people were paying attention to the island and that it had become an important part of the way people thought about women and love. In some cases, the influence of Lesbos reached beyond Greece and touched other cultures. Travelers from far away came to the island, and they took what they learned back to their own lands. Some of them wrote about what they saw, and others simply carried the memory of the island with them. These stories helped spread the idea that women could form deep emotional bonds with each other, and that these bonds were a natural part of life. Even in places where women were not allowed to live freely, the idea of Lesbos remained as a symbol of what was possible. The schools for women on Lesbos also had a lasting influence. Many of the girls who studied there came from other parts of Greece, and when they returned home, they brought with them the ideas and values they had learned. Some of them continued to write poetry, some of them taught their own daughters, and others simply carried the memory of the island with them for the rest of their lives. These women helped spread the culture of Lesbos to other places, and they showed that the island's influence was not limited to its own shores. Because of the way the culture of Lesbos spread, the island became more than just a place on a map. It became a symbol of freedom, love, and the power of women to live their lives in their own way. Even though many of the details about life on the island were lost over time, the idea of Lesbos remained. It became a place that people remembered, a place that inspired poetry and music, and a place that changed the way people thought about women and their relationships. The influence of Lesbos also showed that ideas can travel far beyond the places where they begin. Even though the island was small, its culture had a big impact on the world around it. It helped shape the way people thought about love, it gave women a way to express their feelings, and it showed that women could live full and meaningful lives even in a world that often tried to limit them. The women of Lesbos may not have ruled empires or built great cities, but they changed the way people saw the world, and they left behind a legacy that continues to live on. Even now, thousands of years later, the name of the island is still connected with love between women. The word lesbian is still used to describe this kind of love, and the island is still remembered as the place where it began. The women who lived there may have been ordinary people, but they helped create something that lasted far beyond their own time. Their lives, their poetry, and their relationships continue to inspire people even today, and they remind us that love between women has always been a part of history. The culture of Lesbos was not just about love, it was also about freedom, expression, and the power of women to shape their own lives. It was a culture that gave women space to grow, to feel, and to love in ways that were not always possible elsewhere. And because of that, the island of Lesbos will never be forgotten. As time passed, the way people thought about love between women began to change. What had once been accepted and even celebrated on the island of Lesbos slowly became less understood and, in some places, even discouraged. These changes did not happen all at once, but rather over many years, as new ideas, new leaders, and new beliefs began to shape the way people saw the world. The freedom that women had once enjoyed on Lesbos became harder to find, and the deep emotional bonds between women were no longer always seen as normal or natural. One of the reasons for this change was the rise of new political and religious ideas. In many parts of Greece, and especially in cities like Athens, the role of women in society became more limited. Laws were made that kept women from living together in schools or forming close relationships with other women outside of marriage. Women were expected to spend more time in the home, to take care of their husbands and children, and to avoid forming deep emotional connections with other women. These changes made it harder for women to live the way they once had on Lesbos. Religious beliefs also played a role in how people saw love between women. As new gods and new moral codes became more important, some of the older traditions that had allowed women to form close bonds with each other began to fade. In some places, the idea that women could love each other in deep and meaningful ways was seen as something that went against the rules of society. These ideas were not always the same everywhere, but they did affect the way many people thought about women and their relationships. The schools for women on Lesbos, which had once been centers of learning, music, poetry, and love, also began to change. Over time, fewer girls came to study there, and the schools became smaller and less important. Some of them closed completely, while others changed their focus and stopped teaching poetry and music in the same way. The teachers who had once guided young women in their emotional and creative growth were no longer as respected, and their way of life slowly disappeared. Even the poetry of Sappho, which had once been widely read and admired, began to be seen in a different light. Some people continued to love her words and to see them as beautiful expressions of human emotion, but others tried to change the way she was remembered. Her poems were sometimes taken out of context, or they were used to support ideas that were very different from what she had meant. In some cases, people tried to say that her poetry was not really about love between women at all, even though that had been clear to many people in the past. The island of Lesbos itself also changed. As new rulers came to power and new laws were made, the way of life that had once made the island special slowly disappeared. The women who had lived freely and formed deep bonds with each other found themselves living in a world that was less accepting of their choices. Some of them left the island, while others tried to keep their traditions alive in secret. But even as the island changed, the memory of what had once been there did not disappear completely. In other parts of Greece and in other cultures, the idea of love between women continued to exist, but it was often hidden or not spoken about openly. Some women still formed close friendships and emotional bonds with each other, but they did so in ways that were less visible. They wrote letters instead of poems. They lived together in ways that looked like friendship rather than love, and they found ways to express their feelings without drawing attention to themselves. These women were not always free to live the way they wanted, but they still found ways to love and to care for each other. Over time, the word lesbian continued to be used, but the meaning behind it changed. In some places, it was used in a way that was not always kind, and it was sometimes used to make fun of women who did not follow the usual rules of society. But even when the word was used in a negative way, it still carried with it the memory of the island of Lesbos and the women who had once lived there. It was a reminder that love between women had always been a part of history, even if it was not always accepted. As centuries passed, the story of Lesbos and the women who lived there became more of a legend than a real part of history. Some people forgot where the word lesbian had come from, and some people did not know that it had once been linked to a real place and a real way of life. But the idea of women loving each other did not disappear. It continued to exist in secret, in letters, in poems, and in the lives of women who found each other even when the world around them did not understand them. Even though the schools on Lesbos were gone and the way of life that had once made the island special had changed, the feelings that had been so common there were still very real. Women still felt love, they still felt longing, and they still formed deep emotional bonds with each other. These feelings did not disappear just because society changed, they simply found new ways to exist, and they continued to shape the lives of women for many years to come. The story of how the perception of female love changed over time is not a simple one. It is a story of loss and of memory, of silence and of hidden voices. It is a story of how some ideas are forgotten while others are remembered, and of how the way people see the world can change with time. But even in the face of these changes, the legacy of the women of Lesbos remained. It remained in the word that was used to describe love between women, in the poetry that was still read, and in the quiet lives of women who continued to love each other even when no one else knew. The women of Lesbos may not have been able to stop the changes that came with time, but they left behind something that could not be erased. They left behind a history of love, of freedom, and of the deep emotional bonds that could form between women. And even though the world around them changed, the memory of what they had once created on the island never truly disappeared. The island of Lesbos is no longer the same place it was in the year 500 BCE, but its legacy lives on in ways that are both deep and lasting. The women who lived there, the poetry they wrote, the music they sang, and the love they shared all helped shape the way people think about women and their relationships. Even though the island has changed, and even though many of the details of daily life there have been lost, the memory of what happened on Lesbos has not disappeared. Lesbos was once known as a place where women could live freely, where they could form deep emotional bonds with each other, and where they could express their feelings in ways that were accepted and even celebrated. The schools for women, the poetry of Sappho, and the way women lived together all made the island a special place in the ancient world. These things helped create a culture that was different from many other places, and they gave women a chance to grow, to learn, and to love in ways that were not always possible elsewhere. Even after the schools disappeared and the way of life on the island changed, the ideas that had begun there continued to spread. The word lesbian came from the name of the island, and it became a way to describe love between women. This word is still used today, and it carries with it the memory of the women who once lived on Lesbos. It reminds people that love between women is not new, and that it has always been a part of human history. The poetry of Sappho played a big role in keeping the memory of Lesbos alive. Even though many of her poems were lost over time, the ones that survived gave people a glimpse into the lives of women who lived more than 2,000 years ago. Her words were filled with emotion, and they described a kind of love that was real, deep, and meaningful. These poems helped show that women have always had the ability to feel deeply, to love openly, and to live in ways that are true to themselves. Over the centuries, the story of Lesbos has been remembered in many different ways. Some people have studied the history of the island, some have read the poetry of Sappho, and others have simply carried the word lesbian with them as part of their identity. Each of these ways of remembering has helped keep the legacy of Lesbos alive, and they have all played a role in shaping the way people understand love between women today. The island itself has also continued to be a place of meaning for many people. Even though the way women live there is no longer the same as it was in ancient times, the name of the island still carries a special weight. People who visit Lesbos often feel a connection to its past, and they understand that the island was once a place where women could be free. This connection helps remind people that history is not just something that happened long ago, it is something that still affects the present. The legacy of Lesbos is not only about love between women, it is also about the power of women to shape their own lives. The women who lived on the island showed that they could be more than just wives and mothers. They could be poets, musicians, teachers, and lovers. They could live together, they could support each other, and they could build lives that were full of meaning and emotion. These women helped prove that women have always had the strength to live in ways that are true to themselves, even in a world that often tried to limit them. Even now, thousands of years later, the influence of Lesbos can still be felt. The idea that women can love each other, that they can form deep emotional bonds, and that they can live full and meaningful lives continues to be important. The women of Lesbos may not have ruled empires or built great cities, but they changed the way people saw the world. They helped create a history that continues to inspire people even today. The story of Lesbos also reminds us that history is not always written by the people who lived it. Many of the details about life on the island were lost over time, and some of the stories about the women who lived there were changed or misunderstood. But even with these gaps in the record, the core of what happened on Lesbos remains clear. Women loved each other deeply, they formed strong communities, and they lived in ways that were different from what was common in other parts of the ancient world. Because of this, the island of Lesbos will never be forgotten. It has become more than just a place on a map. It has become a symbol of freedom, of love, and of the strength of women. The women who lived there may have been ordinary people, but they helped create something that lasted far beyond their own time. Their lives, their poetry, and their relationships continue to inspire people even today. The legacy of Lesbos also shows that the past is not always separate from the present. The way people think about love, the way they understand relationships, and the way they see women's roles in society have all been shaped by the history of the island. Even people who have never heard of Lesbos may still be affected by the ideas that began there. These ideas have traveled far beyond the island, and they continue to shape the way people live their lives today. In many ways, the story of Lesbos is still being written. Every time a woman reads the poetry of Sappho, every time someone learns about the history of the island, and every time a person chooses to live in a way that is true to themselves, the legacy of Lesbos continues. The island may be small, but its influence is large, and it has helped shape the way people understand love, freedom, and the power of women to live their lives on their own terms. The women of Lesbos were not just part of history, they helped create it. They showed that love between women is real, that it is powerful, and that it has always been a part of the human experience. Their story may be old, but it is still important, and it still has the power to move us and to teach us about the strength of women's love. Even now, thousands of years after the women of Lesbos first sang their songs and wrote their poems, their voices can still be heard. They remind us that love between women has always existed, that it has always mattered, and that it will always be a part of the human story.